Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where history slows down, the sea grows quiet, and the past is allowed to speak at a gentler pace. Tonight, we are setting out across the largest ocean on Earth, following wooden ships, tired sailors, careful maps, strange coastlines, and one of the most famous explorers who ever stood on a quarterdeck. His name was Captain James Cook, and by the time this story begins, he had already sailed farther than most people of his age could even imagine. He had crossed the Pacific, charted islands, measured coastlines, survived storms, ice, hunger, illness, and long months of empty water. He had become, in Britain, something close to a living instrument of discovery. Not a myth exactly, he was too practical for that. But certainly a man whose name had begun to sound larger than the man himself. And yet, the journey we are beginning tonight is not the story of a young captain setting out to prove himself. It is the story of a man already famous, already worn by distance, already shaped by years at sea, asked to sail once more into a puzzle that had tempted Europe for centuries. Somewhere beyond the known edges of the Pacific, beyond the cold reaches of Alaska, beyond fog, rock, ice and dangerous currents, there might be a passage, a route through the top of North America, a sea road connecting the Pacific and the Atlantic, the Northwest Passage. For merchants, it promised shorter routes and richer trade. For governments, it promised power. For explorers, it promised the kind of achievement that could outlive them. And for Cook, it offered one last great task, one more stretch of blank space to test against the compass. Before we go farther, I wonder where you're listening from tonight. Are you somewhere close to the sea, where the air smells faintly of salt and damp stone? Or are you far inland, with only the quiet hum of the room around you, and perhaps a cup of tea nearby, hopefully not already gone cold in the heroic tradition of forgotten bedtime drinks? And if you are listening late at night, as many of our fellow travellers do, what hour is it in your little corner of the world? There is something fitting about beginning a voyage like this from so many different places. One person listening under rain, another under summer heat, another with a window open to city lights. All of us for a while gathering around the same old map. If this kind of slow history helps you rest or keeps your thoughts company at the end of a long day, I would be grateful if you gave the video a like, subscribed, or simply stayed a while. It helps this quiet corner reach more people who enjoy stories told without hurry, with enough detail to learn something, and enough softness to let the mind loosen its grip on the day. So settle in. Let the room become still. We're not rushing to the ending, though history already knows where it waits. We're beginning at the edge of a final voyage, when the ships are still whole, the sails are still bright enough to catch the wind, the men still believe they are bound for glory, and Captain Cook still stands at the centre of it all, steady, experienced, and not yet aware that this expedition will carry him from the height of his reputation into the shadow of his own undoing. The world of the late 18th century was smaller than ours in some ways and much larger in others. Smaller, because European empires were pressing their flags, ships and ambitions into almost every ocean. Larger, because so much of the planet was still uncertain to them. Maps had edges that faded into guesswork. Coastlines were missing. Islands appeared in one sailor's account and vanished in another. There were rumours of lands, channels, currents and passages that might exist, or might simply be the result of bad weather, bad instruments, or a man at sea wanting very much to believe he had seen something important. In that world, a navigator could change history by making a line on paper. A careful chart could turn danger into a route. A measured coastline could become a claim. A bay could become a harbour could become a settlement could become a colony. There was discovery in this, yes, and there was science, and there was genuine human courage. But there was also power moving quietly behind the sextants and specimen jars. The age of exploration was never only about curiosity, it was also about possession. It was about who named a place, who wrote it down, who returned with ships, who came after, and what happened to the people who had already been living there for generations. That is part of what makes Cook's final voyage so important and so uneasy to look at. It begins with the language of Enlightenment science. The voyage carried men interested in astronomy, geography, natural history, and the careful improvement of knowledge. It followed a captain known for discipline, skill, and unusual concern for the health of his crews. Cook had earned respect not simply because he sailed far, but because he brought ships home. That mattered. In an age when long voyages could turn a crew into a floating hospital, Cook's success against scurvy and his strict routines of cleanliness, diet, and order helped make him famous. He was not a gentleman adventurer playing at danger. He was a working seaman who had risen through ability. He knew ropes, weather, men, charts, and coastlines. He had patience. He had stamina. He had a mind built for observation. And yet, on this last expedition, the qualities that had made him great would be placed under a long, slow strain. The voyage would stretch across years. It would move between warm islands and frozen seas, between welcome and suspicion, between trade and theft, between ceremony and misunderstanding. Men would become tired. Ships would need repair. Supplies would run low. Expectations would clash. Cook himself, once known for restraint, would appear harsher at times, quicker to punish, more willing to use force. Whether this came from age, illness, exhaustion, pressure, or the grinding effect of command over too many miles, historians still discuss. But the pattern is difficult to ignore. The voyage that was meant to crown his career began to reveal the limits of the man. It is easy, from a comfortable room more than 2 centuries later, to imagine these expeditions as clean lines across a blue map. A ship leaves England. It rounds a cape. It crosses an ocean. It reaches an island. It goes north. It meets ice. It returns south. But a voyage was not aligned to the people living inside it. It was damp clothing, cramped quarters, salt meat, argument, boredom, fear, and the constant sound of wood under stress. It was sleep interrupted by weather. It was the smell of tar, bilge water, smoke, and unwashed wool. It was months of looking at the same faces in close quarters, which is a heroic achievement in itself, especially if one of those faces snores like a damaged concertina. Aboard Cook's ships, every day had its tasks. Sails had to be adjusted, decks scrubbed, pumps worked, instruments checked, watches kept, birds and fish noted, shorelines sketched, supplies counted. The sea was not empty to them, but it was often repetitive. A sailor might go days seeing only waves, sky, and the slow labour of the ship. Then suddenly land would appear, and everything would change. A dark shape on the horizon, a line of trees, smoke rising somewhere inland, canoes coming out from shore, people watching the ships as strange arrivals. The Europeans looked with curiosity, calculation, hunger, and sometimes fear. The islanders and coastal communities looked back with their own knowledge, their own politics, their own caution, and their own reasons for deciding whether these visitors were guests, threats, traders, fools, or something else entirely. This matters because Cook's final expedition was not only a European story, it was also a Pacific story. It moved through places that were already named, known, farmed, sailed, governed, loved, and fought over by the people who lived there. Tahiti was not waiting to be found. Tonga was not a blank space. Hawaii, when Cook arrived there, was not an empty paradise placed conveniently in the ocean for tired Europeans to admire. These were living societies with rules, hierarchies, sacred systems, rivalries, memories, and skilled navigators of their own. The Pacific was not a void. It was a world of roots. A world of canoes, chants, genealogies, fishing grounds, temples, chiefs, farmers, priests, and families. Cook's greatness, if we use that word carefully, came partly from his ability to move through this world with unusual attention. He recorded, he measured, he compared. He tried, at least at times, to understand before acting. But he was still an officer of empire. His ships carried iron, guns, disease, trade goods, livestock and assumptions. Wherever they went, they changed the balance of local life, sometimes slightly, sometimes permanently. A nail could become a treasure. A stolen tool could become a crisis. A goat or cow could become a future problem. A misunderstanding could become a death. History often turns not only on grand decisions, but on small exchanges that happen on a beach, while several groups of tired men fail to understand one another properly. And so this expedition asks us to hold more than one thought at once. Cook was brave. Cook was skilled. Cook expanded European knowledge of the Pacific and the Arctic. Cook's voyages carried science across the oceans. Cook's maps were extraordinary. All of that is true. It is also true that his voyages helped open the door to colonial expansion, disruption, and violence. It is true that the people he encountered were not side characters in his story. They were human beings meeting an event that would sometimes alter their future in ways no one on the beach could fully see. The final voyage began in 1776, the same year that another part of the British Empire was busy having a very serious disagreement across the Atlantic. While revolution stirred in North America, Cook sailed from England with HMS Resolution, and soon after HMS Discovery. The public purpose of the expedition had a scientific shape, but the Admiralty also had a secret instruction. Cook was to search for the Northwest Passage from the Pacific side. He would cross into the ocean he knew so well, move through familiar islands, push north to the coast of North America, and try to find a route through the ice toward the Atlantic. There is something almost unreasonable about the size of that plan. First, sail halfway around the world, then cross the Pacific, then climb into the far north, then search a frozen maze, then return if the sea allows it. Even reading it now, one can almost hear the ocean clearing its throat politely, as if to say, that is a confident itinerary. But this was the kind of confidence empire often had. The map contained a blank, and so someone had to go there. Cook had filled blank spaces before. He had done what others failed to do. If there was a man Britain trusted with a near-impossible voyage, it was him. Still, he was not the same man who had first sailed into the Pacific on the Endeavour. He was older. He had already endured 2 great voyages. He had been praised, promoted, painted, and honoured. He had earned rest. In fact, he had taken a post at Greenwich Hospital, a comfortable position compared with another brutal expedition. But the sea, or duty, or ambition, or some mixture of all 3, pulled him back. Perhaps it is hard for a man who has spent his life moving across unknown water to sit quietly on land while the largest unanswered question of navigation waits somewhere in the ice. Perhaps the unfinished map was louder than comfort, and what a strange task it was, to search for warmth by sailing toward cold. The Northwest Passage had haunted European imagination for centuries. It was not only a route, it was a promise. A way to avoid the long southern passages around Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope. A way to connect markets, shorten voyages, outmaneuver rivals, and turn geography into profit. Many had searched from the Atlantic side and failed. Ice blocked them, weather punished them, crews suffered, ships vanished. The Arctic did not care for European ambition. It had a quiet way of making plans look silly. Cook's approach would be different. He would come from the Pacific, from the west. To do that, he first had to pass once more through the ocean that had made his name. The early stages of the voyage would seem, on the surface, almost like a return to familiar waters. Islands, harbours, exchanges, observations, the careful taking on of supplies, the study of languages, customs, plants, animals, currents and stars. Men who had sailed with Cook before knew some of this rhythm. The Pacific could be generous, it could also be tense. A beach landing might begin with gifts and end with muskets raised. A feast might sit beside suspicion. A friendly trade might sour over a missing object. Nothing was simple, though Europeans often wrote as if it should have been. As we follow this voyage, we will not hurry from one famous event to the next. We will move slowly enough to feel how the expedition changed. At first there is confidence. There is the familiar cook, organised and commanding. There are scientists and officers, boats lowered, instruments carried ashore, journals opened. There are Pacific communities meeting the ships with curiosity and strategy. Then the journey stretches northward. The weather changes, the sea becomes colder, coastlines become harder. The expedition reaches the edge of what its ships and men can bear. The dream of the passage meets ice, and ice is not impressed by reputation. After that, the voyage turns south again, toward Hawaii, toward repair, rest, ceremony, misunderstanding, and the dark final movement of Cook's life. It is tempting to see the end as sudden. One day he is the great navigator, the next he is dead on a beach at Kealakekua Bay. But history rarely breaks without first bending. The tragedy at Hawaii did not come from one moment alone. It grew from fatigue, pressure, cultural confusion, unequal power, theft, retaliation, sacred timing, human pride, and decisions made in heat and noise. By the time violence came, too much had already tightened. For now, though, the ships are still at the start. The Atlantic lies behind them. The long road into the Pacific waits ahead. Cook stands in command, perhaps already feeling the weight of one more impossible assignment. Around him are men who trust his skill, even if they cannot know how far this trust will carry them. Ahead are islands where welcome and unease will sit side by side. Ahead are northern waters where the sea will turn hard and pale. Ahead is the final return to Hawaii, where Cook's name will pass from living command into argument, memory, grief, and legend. So let the night settle around you. Picture the harbour slowly falling behind, the sails filling, the ropes creaking, the ship leaning into open water. No engines, no radio. No satellite map blinking helpfully in the corner, only wood, canvas, iron, wind, discipline, mathematics, and hope. The kind of hope that can carry a ship across the world, and the kind that can sometimes carry a man too far. By the time James Cook was asked to sail on his final expedition, he was no longer an unknown naval officer waiting for his chance. He was the man Britain sent when the map still had an argument with the sea. He had crossed oceans that could swallow months without leaving a landmark behind. He had traced coastlines that European cartographers had only guessed at. He had sailed into heat, cold, fog, reefs, and storms. And somehow he had returned with charts so careful that other sailors could follow them. That was one of Cook's great gifts. He did not merely go somewhere, he made the going repeatable. He turned a dangerous coastline into a drawn line, a bay into a measured harbour, an island into a place with bearings, soundings, notes and warnings. There is a certain kind of fame that comes from victory in battle, where drums, flags and speeches do much of the work. Cook's fame was different. It was made of patience. It was made of repeated observations, corrected angles, checked instruments, and long days spent watching a coast inch by in difficult weather. It was not glamorous in the usual way. No one looks especially heroic while calculating latitude with cold fingers and a damp notebook, though it is probably a fine test of character. Cook's reputation came from exactness. He was the man who could be trusted with uncertainty. In an age when a mistaken chart could kill a crew, that was no small thing. He had not been born into the world of polished officers and inherited command. James Cook was born in 1728 in Marton in Yorkshire, the son of a farm labourer, and his early life gave little obvious sign that he would become one of the most widely travelled men of his century. His rise was not smooth, and it was not handed to him. He learned through work, he learned through ships, he learned through the weather-beaten education of the North Sea, where a young sailor could discover very quickly that the sea had no interest in family background. A wave does not ask who your father was before it comes over the bow. It simply arrives. Cook first worked in merchant shipping connected with the coal trade, the kind of practical, sturdy seamanship that taught men how ships behaved under strain. Later in 1755 he joined the Royal Navy, where his ability in navigation, surveying and mathematics began to carry him upward. This matters because Cook's greatness was not the greatness of a reckless adventurer. He was not a man who simply pointed a ship toward an empty horizon and trusted luck to applaud him. He was trained by work that punished carelessness. Colliers, those heavy coal-carrying vessels he knew from his early years, were not pretty ships, but they were strong, practical, and built to carry weight. In a way, they suited Cook. He would later command ships of that same plain, useful character. Not delicate naval racehorses, but broad, tough vessels that could carry supplies, survive rough seas, and take punishment from long voyages. There is something almost fitting about it. A plain ship for a plain-spoken man. A solid hull for a stubborn mind. During the 7 Years' War, Cook's skill as a surveyor became especially important. He helped chart difficult waters in North America, including the St. Lawrence River and later the coast of Newfoundland. These were not small achievements. Good charts were military tools, commercial tools, and survival tools. A channel properly surveyed could allow ships to move where enemies thought they could not. A coast properly recorded could help future vessels avoid wreck. The work demanded discipline rather than drama. It meant measuring, sounding, checking, correcting, and resisting the temptation to turn guesswork into confidence. Cook became known for doing this work well. Before he mapped far parts of the Pacific for European use, he had already proved himself in colder Atlantic waters. Imagine him then, not yet the famous Captain Cook of paintings and schoolbooks, but a working naval officer bent over charts, building his future one measured coastline at a time. No grand legend yet, no final beach in Hawaii, no statue, just a man doing careful work. It is worth keeping that image in mind, because fame can make historical figures look as if they were always inevitable, as if Cook was born already holding a sextant, gazing nobly toward Tahiti, perhaps politely asking the midwife for the nearest longitude. But lives do not happen like that. His reputation was built slowly. By the time the Admiralty and the Royal Society were planning a scientific expedition to the Pacific in 1768, Cook had earned the kind of trust that made him useful for a voyage where failure could be expensive, embarrassing, and deadly. That first Great Pacific voyage had a public scientific purpose. Cook was to take observers to Tahiti to witness the transit of Venus in 1769, when the planet would pass across the face of the Sun. Observations of that event, taken from different places around the world, could help scientists calculate the scale of the solar system more accurately. It was a grand Enlightenment project, full of mathematics, astronomy, and international ambition, which is to say it was exactly the kind of thing that sounds calm in a scientific paper and feels rather different when you have to sail halfway around the world in a wooden ship to do it. Cook was given command of HMS Endeavour, a sturdy Whitby-built bark, and the voyage carried important scientific figures, including Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander. Endeavour's mission, however, didn't end with Venus. After the observations at Tahiti, Cook had additional instructions to search the South Pacific and investigate the old European idea of a great southern continent, often imagined as Terra Australis. This was one of those long-lived geographical beliefs that had spent years sitting comfortably in European imagination, rather like an elderly relative in a favourite chair, not easily moved even when evidence began to suggest it might be in the way. Many thinkers believed that a vast southern landmass must exist to balance the known lands of the Northern Hemisphere. Cook's task was to test that belief against the ocean itself. From Tahiti, Cook sailed into the wider Pacific and reached New Zealand. He did not merely touch at it and move on. He circumnavigated and charted it with remarkable care, showing that it was not part of some vast southern continent. Then he crossed the Tasman Sea and reached the eastern coast of Australia, known to Europeans at the time as New Holland. In 1770, Endeavour moved along that coast, stopping at a place that became known as Botany Bay because of the extensive plant collecting carried out there by Banks, Solander, and the expedition's scientific party. The voyage gathered a huge amount of scientific material, including many plant specimens new to European science. This is where Cook's story becomes both impressive and complicated. For European science and navigation, the voyage was extraordinary. Charts improved, collections grew, astronomers, botanists, artists, and naturalists carried home new information. But for the people already living in those places, the arrival of Endeavour was not simply a scientific event. It was an intrusion, a meeting, a warning, and in time a beginning of much larger changes. Australia, New Zealand, Tahiti, and the many islands of the Pacific were not empty spaces waiting for European names. They were inhabited worlds. They had histories, languages, law, ceremony, trade, memory, and land use. Cook's charts may have made these places clearer to Britain, but they did not make them real. They were real already. Still, if we are trying to understand why Cook was chosen for the final expedition, we have to understand the enormous effect of that first voyage on his reputation. He'd gone out as a capable but relatively obscure officer. He returned as a navigator of rare ability. He had shown he could command a long scientific voyage, manage difficult relations with crews and strangers, observe carefully, and produce results that mattered. The voyage was also remembered for Cook's efforts to preserve the health of his crew, particularly in relation to scurvy, though disease after the ship reached Batavia still took a terrible toll. That contrast is important. Cook was not a magician who could defeat every danger of 18th century voyaging, but he paid attention to diet, cleanliness, ventilation, and routine in ways that helped distinguish him from many commanders of the period. After the first voyage, he might already have been remembered as an important explorer. But Cook's career did not stop there. His second Pacific voyage from 1772 to 1775 was even more demanding in some ways. This time he commanded Resolution, accompanied for part of the voyage by Adventure under Tobias Furneaux. The aim was to push far south and finally determine whether the imagined southern continent existed in temperate latitudes. Cook sailed into some of the harshest waters on Earth, through cold, fog, ice, and long empty stretches, where the ocean seemed determined to make a mockery of neat theories. In January 1773, he became the first known navigator to cross the Antarctic Circle. The second voyage did something unusual. It became famous partly for proving a negative. Cook did not find the great southern continent that many had expected. Instead, by sailing far into the southern oceans, he showed that if a major southern landmass existed, it must lie much closer to the pole, locked behind ice, and far from the warm, useful continent some Europeans had imagined. This was not the sort of discovery that gives you an easy picture for a painting. It is simpler to paint a man planting a flag on a beach than a man proving that a popular geographical idea is mostly wrong. But scientifically, it mattered. A blank on the map had not been filled with land, it had been filled with understanding. The second voyage also strengthened Cook's reputation as a commander who could keep men alive on long voyages. The National Museum of Australia notes that on this voyage, despite months spent in Antarctic waters and long periods away from fresh supplies, none of Cook's crew died of scurvy. That fact became central to his standing in scientific circles. In 1776, Cook wrote to Sir John Pringle, then President of the Royal Society, describing the methods he used to preserve health aboard Resolution. For this work, Cook was awarded the Copley Medal, one of the Royal Society's highest honours. Think for a moment about what that meant in the practical world of 18th century exploration. A captain did not only need to know where to go, he needed to keep enough men alive to get there, do the work, and come back. A ship's crew was not a decoration. It was the engine, the repair shop, the weather service, the muscle, the memory, and occasionally the complaint department, all packed into one crowded wooden world. If sickness broke them, the voyage broke with them. Cook's attention to health, discipline, and routine made him valuable because it increased the possible length of a voyage. It allowed Britain to imagine longer missions, deeper searches, and more ambitious instructions. The safer the ship, the larger the dream. But let us not make him too smooth. Cook could be stern. He was a naval officer in a hard age, and discipline at sea could be severe. The same order that kept a ship alive could also become harsh. The same confidence that allowed a captain to push through storms could become stubbornness. The same belief in command that made survival possible could make misunderstanding more dangerous when facing societies with their own rules and authorities. Cook's earlier voyages already contained moments of conflict, theft, punishment, fear, and violence. These did not begin in Hawaii. They were part of the contact zone wherever European ships entered Pacific worlds with metal, guns, livestock, hunger, curiosity, and assumptions. Still, to many in Britain, Cook seemed almost the ideal explorer. He had no grand aristocratic manner. He had risen by ability. He was practical, sober, observant, and skilled. His journals showed attention to detail. His charts were admired. His crews survived. His voyages carried science. His background made his rise feel like proof that talent could climb, at least when talent was useful to the Navy and the Empire. He was in many ways the right man for an age that liked to imagine itself reasonable, improving, and brave. There was also something about Cook's Pacific work that changed the European sense of the planet. Before his voyages, the Pacific was known, crossed and inhabited, of course, especially by the peoples who had navigated it for centuries with extraordinary skill. But to European powers, it remained partly uncertain, full of reports, rumours, incomplete coastlines, and unresolved questions. Cook's voyages gave European mapmakers a new structure. New Zealand became more clearly outlined on European charts. The eastern coast of Australia entered British imperial geography. Southern waters were tested. Islands were located with greater accuracy. Routes became more reliable. The Pacific, in European eyes, became less of a mystery and more of a field of movement. That phrase, in European eyes, is doing important work. Because Cook did not discover the Pacific, he entered it. He did not discover societies that already knew themselves. He encountered them. He did not create geography. He translated parts of it into a form that European naval and imperial systems could use. This distinction is not a small modern correction added politely at the edge of the story. It changes the story itself. Cook's greatness, if we call it that, was not that he found empty places. It was that he produced highly effective knowledge for a powerful maritime empire. That knowledge was scientific, navigational, and practical. It was also political. By the mid-1770s, after 2 great voyages, Cook had earned a kind of rest that few sailors ever reached. He had been promoted. He had been honoured. He had become famous among those who followed exploration, science, and naval achievement. He had a wife, Elizabeth, and a family life that had been repeatedly interrupted by long absences. The sea had given him status, but it had also taken time from him, ordinary human time, the kind measured not by longitude but by meals missed, children growing, and years spent away from home. Exploration always sounds cleaner when written on a map than when counted in family absence. Cook accepted a position connected with Greenwich Hospital, a respectable appointment that might have let him remain ashore. After 2 Pacific expeditions, no one could reasonably say he had failed to serve. He had done enough for several careers. He had crossed the world, returned with results, and given Britain more than it had asked from most men. There is a quiet sadness in this point, because the final expedition did not have to happen for Cook personally. He could have become a famous retired navigator, a man visited for advice, praised at dinners, remembered by scientists and allowed to grow older on land. But the map still had one large question left for him. The Northwest Passage had been tempting European explorers for generations. If there were a navigable route through the top of North America, it could connect the Atlantic and Pacific by a shorter northern path. The idea was commercially powerful and strategically attractive. Many had searched from the Atlantic side and found ice, hardship, and frustration. The passage, if it existed in a usable form, seemed to hide behind cold, distance, and geography that resisted wishful thinking. By the time of Cook's third voyage, the plan was to approach the question from the Pacific side, using the skills of the man who had already done so much to make that ocean legible to Britain. And so we arrive at the strange tension in Cook's life before the final voyage. He had already mapped enough of the world to be remembered. He had already proved his skill beyond ordinary doubt. He had already shown that scientific exploration, naval discipline, and practical seamanship could be joined in a single command. Yet the very success that made him worthy of rest also made him the obvious choice for one more task. Fame can become a door that opens only onto more labour. Once you are known as the man who can do the impossible, people develop the inconvenient habit of bringing you impossible things. It is tempting to imagine Cook accepting the final mission with simple enthusiasm, eager to feel the deck beneath his feet again. Perhaps there was some of that. He had spent his life at sea, and men shaped by long command do not always settle easily into stillness. But there may also have been duty, ambition, habit, and the pull of unfinished geography. The Northwest Passage was not just another route, it was a prize of centuries. To find it would be to place his name beside one of the greatest navigational achievements imaginable. To fail honourably would still mean carrying British science and naval power into regions where few had gone from that direction. For Cook, it was a final chance to complete the shape of his own legend. Yet legends are dangerous things for living people. A legend does not get tired. A legend does not suffer from stomach trouble, frustration, bad weather, or the mental strain of command. A legend does not have to negotiate with angry islanders over stolen goods, repair worn ships, ration supplies, or manage officers who are themselves exhausted. The real James Cook had to do all of that. The man who sailed in 1776 was not the clean figure of later memory. He was older, experienced, respected, and perhaps more burdened than he appeared. His previous success followed him like a standard, but also like a weight. Before the final voyage could unravel him, it first had to carry him back through the world that had made him famous. The Pacific waited again, broad and demanding. The islands waited, though they were not waiting for him in any simple sense. The ships would return to places where Cook had already left memories, impressions, debts, and disturbances. His name meant something now, not only in London but in parts of the Pacific where his ships had appeared before. Europeans often thought of themselves as the ones recording encounters, but Pacific communities remembered too. They judged returning ships by what had happened earlier. They had their own accounts, their own expectations, their own reasons to welcome, trade, resist, or watch carefully from shore. This is where the final expedition begins to take on its deeper shape. Cook was not sailing into pure unknown. He was sailing into a world partly made by his own earlier voyages. The tools, animals, diseases, stories, and tensions left behind by European contact had begun to alter relationships. The captain who had mapped so much of the world was now moving through consequences, some visible and some still forming. His charts could show reefs, bays, and islands. They could not show every resentment, every sacred boundary, every local rivalry, every memory of insult or exchange. No map can fully chart what people carry in their minds, so as the ships prepare to move toward the Pacific again, we should see Cook clearly. Not as a simple hero, and not as a simple villain. He was a gifted navigator, a disciplined commander, a man of science in practice if not by polite academic training, and a servant of empire. He expanded knowledge and helped expand power. He protected crews and sometimes punished harshly. He observed Pacific peoples with interest and also through the assumptions of his age. He had already achieved greatness, but greatness had not made him free from error. It had only made the consequences of his errors larger. This is the man standing at the threshold of the last voyage. Behind him lie the coal ships of his youth, the St. Lawrence surveys, Newfoundland charts, Tahiti's Venus observation, New Zealand's coastline, Eastern Australia, Antarctic ice, and the long applause of men who admired results from the safety of rooms on land. Ahead lies the Northwest Passage, or rather the dream of it. Ahead lie Tonga, Tahiti, the North Pacific, Alaska, the Bering Strait and Hawaii. Ahead lies the slow change in tone, from confidence to strain, from measured curiosity to sharper conflict, from the great captain in command of his world to a tired man facing situations that no chart could solve. For now, though, the reputation still holds. The name Cook still means control, endurance and accuracy. The ships still have their purpose. The officers still know they are part of something important. The Admiralty still believes that if any man can turn the cold northern uncertainty into knowledge, it is this one, and perhaps Cook believes it too. He has reason to. He has already taken the blank spaces of European maps and filled them with coastlines. He has already sailed farther south than any known navigator before him. He has already carried science across the ocean and brought ships back from the edge of the world. It is not unreasonable that he might look at one more impossible assignment and think it could be done. The trouble is that the sea does not care what a man has already achieved. Ice does not soften because a captain has medals. Wind does not adjust itself for reputation. Human misunderstanding does not disappear because a chart is accurate. The final expedition will test not the young Cook still building his name, but the famous Cook who has begun to live inside it. And that is a different kind of test altogether, because once the world decides you are great, it becomes much harder to admit when you are tired, uncertain, or wrong. The ships move on, carrying with them the memory of past triumphs and the quiet pressure of expectation. Every coil of rope, every barrel of provisions, every instrument packed aboard belongs to a voyage that is both practical and symbolic. Britain wants a passage. Science wants observations. Sailors want survival, pay, and eventually home. Cook wants, perhaps, to finish the work that the map has placed before him. It is a simple arrangement only from a distance. Up close it is crowded with motives, and motives at sea have very little room to breathe. Soon the official purpose of the voyage will begin to show its second face. To the public it can be presented as another mission of science and exploration, another careful extension of knowledge across the ocean. Beneath that, sealed in instructions and carried in the logic of empire, is the colder ambition of the Northwest Passage, a hidden road through the top of the world. And so the great captain, already shaped by 2 vast voyages, turns once more toward the Pacific, not as a beginner, not as a dreamer, but as a man whose own success has brought him to the edge of a final demand. The official shape of the voyage looked almost gentle, at least compared with the kind of work Cook had done before. There was a passenger to return home. There were observations to make. There were islands to revisit, plants to collect, animals to deliver, coastlines to check, and friendships or useful connections to renew across the Pacific. To anyone looking only at the surface, the expedition could appear as another long scientific journey, a careful voyage of knowledge, diplomacy, and natural history. It had artists, instruments, notebooks, chronometers, and men prepared to measure the heavens from a patch of cleared ground beside a beach. That all sounds very civilized, which is often how great imperial plans prefer to introduce themselves. But folded beneath that public face was the true weight of the voyage. Cook was to search for the Northwest Passage. More precisely, he was to approach the old dream from the Pacific side and see whether a route existed through the northern coast of America, a navigable channel that might connect the Pacific with the Atlantic. If he found it, Britain would gain not only a geographical answer, but a commercial and strategic prize. If he did not, then even his failure would bring back knowledge of coastlines, currents, peoples, harbours, ice and limits. Empires are often quite good at turning failure into information, not as satisfying as success perhaps, but still useful, especially if someone else has done all the freezing. The pattern was not entirely new in Cook's career. His first Pacific voyage had also carried a public scientific purpose and a hidden imperial one. The Royal Society wanted observations of the transit of Venus at Tahiti, while the Admiralty used the voyage to pursue territorial and navigational interests, including instructions to search for the imagined southern continent after the astronomical work was finished. The National Library of Australia describes that earlier Endeavour voyage as a joint venture in which imperial goals could be concealed behind the more acceptable purpose of expanding knowledge. Cook had lived inside that mixture before. Science and empire did not travel on separate ships. They shared cabins, meals, instruments, and sometimes the same handwriting. On the third voyage, the public errand had a human face. His name was Mai, better known in Britain as Omai, a young Rayatian man from Hua Hin who had travelled to England after Cook's second voyage. In London, he had become famous. He met George III, attended fashionable gatherings, impressed people with his manners, and appeared in portraits and conversations as a living symbol of the distant Pacific. To British society, he was fascinating, exotic, polite, and useful for many people's ideas about nature, civilization, and humanity. To himself, of course, he was not a symbol. He was a young man far from home, navigating a strange country where people studied him almost as much as they welcomed him. That must have been exhausting, even with fine clothing and royal introductions. Imagine trying to enjoy dinner while everyone at the table is quietly deciding what you represent. Cook's written instructions included returning Omai to the Society Islands, to the island of his choice. Royal Museums. Greenwich notes that Cook was at Hua Hin in October and November 1777 and negotiated with chiefs for land where Omai could settle, even having the ship's carpenters build him a European-style house. This part of the voyage had a softer appearance. It suggested care, obligation, perhaps even friendship. A man who had been carried across the world would be taken home. There was a decent symmetry in it. The Pacific had sent a person to Britain, and Britain would return him with tools, gifts, weapons, animals, and stories that could not easily fit back into the life he had left. Yet even this apparently humane mission was tangled. Omai did not return simply as the same man who had left. He carried European goods, including items of status and practical use, and those goods would have local consequences. A musket was not merely an object, it was power in a new form. A horse was not merely an animal, it was a sign, a curiosity and a complication that needed feeding. A European-style house was not merely shelter, it stood as a visible mark of contact, favour and difference. Cook may have intended to help Omai, but help in a cross-cultural world can arrive with nails, hinges and unintended trouble packed neatly in the hold. The expedition itself was fitted out with more than one purpose in mind. HMS Resolution. Cook's old ship from the second voyage was repaired and refitted. HMS Discovery was chosen as the consort vessel, commanded by Charles Clark, a man with long Pacific experience of his own. The voyage did not carry a large independent scientific party, like the first expedition with Joseph Banks, but it did carry men whose work supported observation and collection. William Anderson, the surgeon, also worked as a naturalist and observer of cultures. William Bailey served as astronomer. David Nelson collected plants for Joseph Banks. John Webber was appointed as the official artist. The National Museum of Australia notes that many of the crew had sailed with Cook before, and that some had enough knowledge of Tahitian to help with communication and collecting in the Pacific. That experience must have made the voyage feel, at least at the beginning, unusually prepared. This was not a blind plunge into the ocean by men with more courage than information. Many aboard knew Cook's methods. Some knew the islands. Some knew how trade might work, how quickly it might sour and how important iron could be. Some knew how to set up an observatory ashore, how to take readings, how to sketch a coastline, how to describe a plant, how to barter without losing one's shirt, or at least without losing the ship's carpenter's entire tool chest, which would have been frowned upon by almost everyone except the person stealing it. The ships carried instruments that represented the most advanced navigation of the day. Chronometers, sextants, telescopes, compasses, charts, and mathematical tables were all part of the expedition's working mind. A voyage like this was not only moved by wind, it was moved by measurement. Every observation helped place the ship more accurately on the globe. Every coastline drawn with care could help later vessels. Every bay examined might become a harbour. Every astronomical reading tightened the relationship between the sky above and the map below. Cook had made his name through this kind of work, and the third voyage would continue it, even while its deeper aim pulled steadily north. This is one reason the phrase secret mission can mislead if it makes the expedition sound like a simple trick. The science was real, the observations were real, the collections, drawings and charts were real. Men genuinely studied plants, languages, animals, currents, stars, weather, and coastlines. They did not merely pretend to be interested in knowledge while sneaking around with a royal shopping list for empire. The more uncomfortable truth is that the knowledge itself was part of imperial power. A chart can be beautiful and useful, and still help future conquest. A drawing can preserve details of a culture and still become part of a system that views that culture from the outside. A specimen can expand botany and also turn a living landscape into something catalogued for distant institutions. Cook's world did not always see a contradiction there. Many educated Europeans of the 18th century believed sincerely in improvement, classification, order and discovery. They believed that measuring the world was a good thing. They believed that knowledge advanced humanity, though they did not always ask which humans would benefit first. A plant collected in the Pacific might be studied in London. A harbour drawn in a journal might later shelter British ships. A description of local customs might help future visitors trade, negotiate or dominate more effectively. Science moved through these voyages with clean hands in its own imagination, but the deck beneath it was not clean of politics. The ships also carried living cargo. Seeds, sheep, goats, cattle, horses and other useful animals were brought along with the idea of stocking or improving islands visited by Europeans. That phrase, useful animals, sounds practical and harmless until one pauses over it. Useful to whom? Useful in what landscape? Useful under whose system of ownership and food production? Introducing animals into island worlds could change land use, local economies, and ecological balances. Goats, for instance, are charming enough in small numbers and absolute little agents of botanical chaos when left to browse freely. A goat does not care whether a plant is rare, sacred, carefully cultivated, or part of a delicate island ecosystem. It sees lunch, and then history happens one mouthful at a time. This practical burden affected the voyage from the start. Ships were already crowded with men, provisions, tools, trade goods, instruments, and now animals needing space, water, and feed. The National Museum of Australia points out that the crowded ships had to make frequent landfalls to get supplies and food for the animals, and that both vessels leaked, contributing to delay and difficulty early in the expedition. A voyage meant to search the northern ice was slowed partly by the warm-blooded business of keeping livestock alive. It is not the grand image usually placed beside heroic exploration, but there it is. Before the Arctic could be challenged, someone had to think about hay. The voyage left England in 1776, a year that already carried the sound of imperial strain. Across the Atlantic, Britain's American colonies were moving through rebellion and revolution. Ships, men, money, and attention were tied to war. Yet Britain still sent Cook into the Pacific. That tells us something. Even during crisis, the search for routes, knowledge, and advantage continued. The Empire didn't operate with one thought at a time. It could fight in one ocean and explore in another. It could lose control in one region while reaching for greater certainty elsewhere. Cook's voyage was part of that wider restless movement, the British state looking outward even as part of its world came apart. There is something oddly quiet about how such a large ambition was placed inside a set of instructions. On land, plans can look orderly. A sentence sends a ship to the other side of the planet. A paragraph sends men into ice. A sealed order contains years of labour, risk, hunger, and possible death. The Admiralty did not have to feel the cold personally when it wrote about northern exploration. The ink dried quickly enough. For Cook and his crews, those words would become weather, distance, disease, conflict, and the daily labour of keeping 2 wooden ships alive. The route itself showed the scale of the undertaking. The ships would move from England to the Atlantic, then south toward the Cape of Good Hope, then across the southern Indian Ocean toward Kerguelen Island, Van Diemen's Land, and New Zealand, before turning into the familiar island networks of the Pacific. From there, after returning Omai and gathering supplies, they would head north into less familiar waters, toward the coast of North America and eventually the Bering Strait. The National Library of Australia summarises Cook's third voyage as one that visited Cape Town, Kerguelen Island, Van Diemen's Land, New Zealand, the Hawaiian Islands, and the North American coast, before reaching the Bering Strait where ice forced the expedition to turn back. Read as a route, it sounds almost impossible to hold in the mind. Read as lived experience, it becomes even larger. Each stop had its own problems, water had to be found, wood had to be cut, trade had to be managed, sick men had to recover if they could, the hulls had to be examined, sails repaired, animals fed, instruments protected, local leaders understood, persuaded, avoided or confronted. The daily discipline of the ship had to continue even when the larger purpose remained far away, hidden behind the next ocean and the next season. A man searching for the Northwest Passage did not wake each morning beside the ice. He woke beside whatever immediate trouble the day had prepared. Cook understood secrecy and instructions. Naval command required obedience, but also judgment. Orders written in London could not cover every beach, gale, reef, illness, or political situation encountered after months at sea. A captain had to interpret. He had to decide when to press forward, when to wait, when to trade, when to punish, when to retreat, and when to pretend he was more certain than he was. The final voyage would stretch those decisions until they became heavier. At the beginning, though, he still had the confidence of a man who had made hard choices before and survived them. Charles Clark, commanding Discovery, brought experience but also difficulty. His departure was delayed because of imprisonment for debt connected to his brother's affairs, a reminder that naval officers, however brave at sea, still belong to the very human world of money, family, paperwork, and inconvenient legal trouble. This delay did not ruin the voyage, but it contributed to an early sense that the expedition was not moving as cleanly as planned. Ships rarely leave history in perfect condition. There is almost always a leak, a delay, a missing item, a sick man, or some official complication standing on the dock with a clipboard and a gloomy expression. The scientific face of the voyage remained visible at every stage. John Webber would draw landscapes, people, tools, ceremonies, and scenes that later shaped European imagination of the Pacific. William Bailey would make astronomical observations. David Nelson would collect botanical specimens. William Anderson would record natural history and cultural details until his own health failed later in the voyage. These men mattered because they made the expedition more than a naval search. They turned movement into record. They produced the materials from which later readers, scientists, artists, and officials would build their understanding, or their misunderstanding, of places they had never seen. The presence of artists and collectors also changed encounters. A person being sketched might become part of a European archive. A tool traded or taken might become a museum object. A plant pressed and labelled might become a scientific specimen disconnected from the people who knew its uses. The expedition's notebooks could preserve details that might otherwise have vanished from European memory, but they also frame those details through European categories. The Pacific was being translated, and translation always loses something, especially when the translator holds a musket and the person being translated is standing on their own shore, wondering how long these guests intend to stay. Omai's return sharpened these tensions in a personal way. In Britain, he'd been admired partly because he was distant from home. Back in the Pacific, he would be judged under local rules. His European clothes, weapons, gifts and manners might impress some and irritate others. Cook could build him a house, but Cook could not build him a stable social future. That depended on island politics, kinship, rank, memory, and the practical matter of whether people around him valued what he had brought. To British eyes, Omai may have looked like someone being restored. To local eyes, he may have looked like a changed man arriving with foreign goods under the protection of foreign ships. That is not the same thing. Cook himself seems to have had mixed feelings about some of what Omai carried. He understood that firearms could create danger. He had spent enough time in the Pacific to know that European objects were not neutral. Iron tools could be useful. Beads and cloth could be traded. But guns shifted power too sharply. They brought European violence into local disputes in a portable form. Even when given as gifts, they were not just gifts. They were future decisions waiting to be loaded. The larger expedition carried a similar problem. It arrived in the language of science and exchange, but it could not stop being an armed naval presence. Resolution and Discovery were not floating universities. They were British ships, commanded by officers under Admiralty instructions, crewed by sailors and marines, defended by cannon and muskets. They could observe a culture in the morning and fire on people by afternoon if events turned badly. This was part of the instability of contact. The same men who traded nails for food might later seize canoes, take hostages, or burn property in retaliation for theft. In their own minds, they were restoring order. In local minds, they might be violating it. Theft was one of the recurring sparks. From the European side, stolen tools or boat parts could threaten the working life of the ship. A stolen cutter, anchor or carpenter's tool was not a minor inconvenience. It could affect survival. From the island side, European objects could be valuable, useful or desirable in ways that Europeans did not always understand. Ideas of ownership differed. Rules of exchange differed. Expectations differed. Then came anger, punishment, confusion, and sometimes violence. It is easy to write a theft occurred in a journal. It is harder to see all the systems of value colliding behind that sentence. Cook's earlier success had often depended on his ability to manage these collisions. He could be patient. He could be firm. He could arrange trades, use local intermediaries, and avoid unnecessary bloodshed at times. But he also believed in command, punishment, and the authority of his own mission. The final voyage would put this belief under pressure. The farther the ships went, the more exhausted the men became. The more delays accumulated, the more the Arctic season mattered. The more supplies were needed, the more contact with local communities became not optional but urgent. A voyage of science and passage-seeking depended on food, water, timber, and cooperation from people who had their own lives to protect. This is why the secret mission matters so much. It placed a northern deadline beneath every southern encounter. The ships might seem to be wandering among islands, returning Omai, collecting plants, trading for pigs, making drawings, and repairing rigging. But the real pressure lay ahead in the ice. Cook needed time. He needed the right season. He needed his ships ready and his crews healthy enough to push into the Bering Strait. Every delay mattered because northern waters opened and closed by the calendar of cold. The Arctic did not offer a long, polite window. It opened briefly, dangerously and without concern for whether a ship had been slowed by livestock, leaks, weather, or diplomacy. So the voyage begins with two different clocks running at once. One clock is visible. It belongs to the daily rhythm of a scientific expedition. Observations, collections, landfalls, repairs, trade, journals, sketches, meals, watches, sleep. The other clock is hidden, but always moving. It belongs to the Northwest Passage, to the season of northern navigation, to the ice waiting beyond the Pacific. Cook had to serve both clocks. He had to appear patient while time tightened. He had to manage local encounters while thinking about a distant frozen coast. He had to return Omai properly, keep animals alive, maintain discipline, gather knowledge, and still reach the north soon enough to make the attempt worthwhile. That kind of pressure can change a commander. It does not have to do so dramatically at first. It may appear as impatience where there used to be restraint, a sharper punishment, a quicker anger, less tolerance for ambiguity, a greater willingness to use force because the larger mission seems too important to be delayed by one stolen object or one failed negotiation. Cook had always been capable of severity, but the final voyage would give that severity more chances to appear. Not all at once, not as a simple transformation from wise captain to broken man. More like a rope taking strain fibre by fibre, until later everyone is surprised when it snaps. For the men aboard, the hidden mission also meant that much of the voyage's hardest work lay beyond the pleasant parts. Tahiti and the Society Islands could offer food, warmth and familiarity. Tonga could offer trade and ceremony. Hawaii, when first encountered, would appear to European eyes as an astonishing and generous discovery. But none of these places was the end. They were stages on the road to cold. Imagine sailing through some of the most beautiful waters on Earth and knowing that your real destination is an ice-choked passage where the sea itself may refuse to open. It is a little like being served dessert and told it is preparation for dental surgery. The expedition's secrecy was not only about hiding information from foreign rivals, it was also about how Britain wished to present itself. A voyage described as scientific sounded noble. A voyage aimed at commercial and strategic advantage sounded more aggressive. In truth, it was both. Cook's third expedition belongs to an age when curiosity and conquest often used the same compass. The men who measured the stars were not lying when they cared about accuracy. The officials who wanted a passage were not absent when the telescopes were set up. They were part of the same system, one that believed a knowledge of the world should be gathered, organised, and made useful. As the ships moved outward, that system became a physical thing. It was there in the paper of the instructions, in the brass of the instruments, in the nails traded on beaches, in the livestock penned aboard, in the muskets stored for discipline and defence, in Weber's sketchbooks, in Bailey's observations, in Nelson's plant collections, and in Cook's own journal. It was there in the way unknown coastlines became British knowledge once drawn. It was there in the way local names might be recorded, altered, or replaced. It was there in the confidence that the world could be entered, measured, named, and then used. Still, the voyage did not feel like a machine to those living it. It felt like labour. It felt like weather. It felt like waiting for the Discovery to join, waiting for repairs, waiting for wind, waiting for supplies, waiting for animals to be loaded, waiting for the next landfall, waiting for the season to turn. Beneath the grand purpose, men did ordinary things. They mended clothes. They complained. They ate. They slept badly. They watched Omai and wondered about him. They looked at the sea and wondered how far north they would have to go. They may have trusted Cook deeply, but trust does not keep out damp, and it does not make salt meat taste better after the 100th meal. Cook's own position was lonelier than it might appear. Command placed him above the men, but not outside the voyage's discomfort. He had to absorb pressure from London, responsibility for the ships, danger from the sea, uncertainty among foreign communities, and the expectations attached to his own name. his officers could advise him, his crew could obey him. But the final decisions came back to him. When to sail, when to stop, when to punish, when to risk ice, when to retreat. That is a great deal of weight for one man, even one already famous for carrying weight. The secret mission therefore gives the voyage its hidden engine. Without it, the early movement through the Pacific might look like a return tour, an aging explorer revisiting familiar seas with a scientific party and a famous passenger. With it, every scene becomes part of a larger movement toward danger. Omai's homecoming, the animals, the drawings, the trades, the repairs, the observations, all of it sits under the shadow of the northern search. The ships are not simply wandering. They are being drawn toward the top of the map, where the warm Pacific will give way to fog, rock, cold water, and a wall of ice that no reputation can command. For now, the crew can still imagine success. The ships are stocked as well as they can be. The captain is the most experienced Pacific navigator in British service. Many of the men know his routines. The expedition carries science, skill, discipline, and a clear objective. If the passage exists, surely Cook has as good a chance as any man alive of finding it. That belief must have settled over the voyage like a practical comfort. Not excitement exactly, not every day. More like confidence built from habit. Cook had gone far before. Cook had returned before. Cook had solved what maps had left uncertain before. But this journey would not behave like the earlier ones. Its purpose was too large, its route too strained, its contact zones too fragile, and its captain perhaps more tired than anyone wanted to admit. The secret instructions did not create the tragedy that would come, but they helped set the pressure under which the tragedy formed. The expedition would have to cross the Pacific not as a leisurely survey, but as a mission with cold waiting at the far end. Every island stop, every trade, every argument, every delay, every repair would become part of that slow tightening. And so Resolution and Discovery carry two stories across the sea. One is the story they can easily tell, the return of Omai, the pursuit of knowledge, the collecting of plants, the drawing of landscapes, the measuring of stars, the ordinary noble business of exploration. The other story is sealed into the voyage's deeper purpose. Find the passage, test the northern coast, bring back the route if it exists, and if it does not, bring back the knowledge of why it cannot be used. Two stories, one deck, two ambitions, one captain. Warm islands ahead, ice beyond them, and somewhere between the two, the first soft signs that this last expedition will ask more of Cook than even he may have left to give. The first months of the voyage did not look like the beginning of a tragedy. They looked, in many ways, like the kind of Pacific expedition Cook understood better than almost anyone in Europe. After the long passage from England, after the Cape of Good Hope, after the cold and lonely stop at Kerguelen Island, after Van Diemen's Land and New Zealand, the ships moved into warmer seas, where the air changed, the colour of the water softened, and land appeared not as a hard northern coast, but as green islands rising out of blue distance. For tired sailors that mattered. A ship at sea is a world, but it is a very cramped one, and after enough weeks aboard, even a modest patch of land can look like paradise, especially if it contains fresh water, fruit, pigs, shade, and people who are not the same 40 faces one has been arguing with since Portsmouth. Cook had been in the Pacific before, of course. That gave the voyage a strange sense of return. These were not the first nervous landfalls of a captain entering a world unknown to him. He had experience here. Some of his officers and men had experience too. They knew that island stops were not idle pauses. They were working events. Food had to be purchased or traded for. Wood had to be cut. Water casks had to be filled. Livestock had to be protected. Observations had to be made. Sick men needed rest. The ships needed inspection. Local leaders had to be met, respected when possible, watched carefully when necessary, and never underestimated. A peaceful island visit could save a voyage. a badly handled one could poison it. The Pacific was generous, but it was not simple. Cook and his men were entering societies with rules of rank, exchange, ritual, sacred space, ownership, hospitality, and punishment. The Europeans could observe some of this and misunderstand much of it at the same time. They might be welcomed warmly and still be under political calculation. They might receive gifts and not fully understand the obligation attached. They might trade iron for food and assume that both sides understood the bargain in exactly the same way. They might think a theft was simple criminal misbehaviour, while local people saw the matter through a different structure of access, power, status, or opportunity. None of this meant people could not understand one another. It meant that understanding took effort, patience, and time. And time, on this voyage, was already being spent faster than Cook wanted. Before the expedition reached Tahiti and the Society Islands, it moved through Tonga, a place Cook had visited before and admired. Tonga had impressed him with its order, fertility, canoes, ceremony, and the confidence of its people. He had called the islands the Friendly Islands because of the reception he received there, though the name itself tells us more about Cook's experience than about the full political reality of Tonga. Friendly to whom, and on what day, and under which chief, is always a useful question. Hospitality can be sincere and strategic at the same time. A smile on a beach does not mean there is no argument in the council house inland. When resolution and discovery came among the Tongan islands on the third voyage, the welcome seemed warm. Canoes came out, people traded, food was available. There were ceremonies, visits, and displays that fascinated the Europeans. Cook saw a society that seemed well organised and abundant. The land was cultivated. There were breadfruit trees, plantains, coconuts, yams, pigs, fowls, and all the useful things a ship's crew longed for after weeks of salted provisions. For men who'd been eating shipboard food, fresh produce was not a luxury. It was medicine, morale, and a reminder that life on land had flavour. A sailor offered a fresh coconut at the right moment might have looked upon it with the seriousness usually reserved for religious relics. The Tongan world was not quiet or simple behind that welcome. Chiefs held power. Rank mattered. Ceremonies were carefully structured. Visitors were placed within systems they didn't fully see. Cook and his officers recorded feasts, dances, wrestling, speeches and exchanges. They admired the canoes and the strength of Tongan seamanship. They noted the skill of the people and the richness of the islands, but they were also being studied. The ships were not just objects of curiosity, they were sources of metal, weapons, cloth, tools, and possible danger. The Europeans thought they were evaluating the islanders were evaluating them as well. This is one of the important things to remember about these encounters. Cook's journals and British accounts give us one side in great detail, because those documents survived in European archives. But the people of Tonga, Tahiti, Wahine, and other islands were not passive figures drifting through someone else's logbook. They were making decisions. They were weighing risk and advantage. They were testing the boundaries of trade, power, and hospitality. They were asking, in their own ways, what these visitors wanted, what they could offer, what they might take, and whether they could be controlled. In Tonga, the surface remained mostly calm, but there were signs that calm did not mean simplicity. Later accounts suggested that some Tongan chiefs may have considered killing Cook and seizing the ships, but that the plan did not happen. Whether every detail of that story can be treated with complete certainty is a matter for historians, but the broader point is not hard to understand. The ships were extraordinary objects. They were filled with wealth from a Tongan point of view. Iron tools alone were immensely valuable. A great European vessel was not merely a visitor's house on the water, it was a floating storehouse, a fortress, a workshop, and a mystery. To local powers, it could be useful, dangerous, or tempting. A chief who welcomed Cook might also wonder how much could be gained from him. That is not treachery in some cartoon sense, it is politics. Cook, for his part, wanted order. He needed supplies, cooperation, and onward movement. His style of command depended on routine, rules, and discipline. In a ship, that could work. On shore, among people not subject to his authority, it was much harder. He could not simply command Tonga. He had to negotiate with it. When things went well, the voyage could look like a peaceful exchange between curious peoples. When things went badly, the difference between guest and armed intruder could become very clear. The soft beginning of trouble did not arrive as one dramatic crisis. It came in small frictions. A tool went missing, a trade was disputed, a man crossed a boundary he did not understand. Sailors behaved badly. Local people tested what they could take. A chief expected one thing, Cook expected another. The ships needed food and water, but the communities ashore had their own interests. Every encounter contained a question that could not always be answered in time. Who controlled the terms of this meeting? Cook had dealt with theft many times before, and to him it was not a small matter. A stolen nail might be irritating. A stolen axe or adze could slow repair work. A stolen boat part could threaten the ship. Iron tools were part of the vessel's survival system. He could be patient, but he could also respond sharply. On earlier voyages, and again on this one, Cook sometimes used the seizure of people or property as pressure to recover stolen goods. This was a tactic Europeans often used in Pacific encounters. To them, it was practical. To island communities, it could be insulting, threatening, or a violation of local authority. It might succeed in the short term and damage relations in the longer term. That pattern matters because it will return later with terrible results. In the warmer islands, it may still seem manageable. A cutter is guarded, a thief is chased, a chief is pressured, an item is returned, gifts are exchanged again, and the visit continues. But each use of force leaves a memory. Each threat teaches both sides something. The Europeans learn that pressure can work. Local people learn that these visitors will seize bodies and goods if angered. What begins as a practical method becomes part of the relationship. By the time events reach Hawaii, the old habit of taking a chief hostage to recover stolen property will no longer be a controlled tool. It will become a spark in dry grass. For now, though, Tonga still gave the expedition what it needed. Food came aboard, observations were made, the men saw ceremonies that impressed them deeply. There were formal exchanges and moments of real fascination. Cook admired much of what he saw. He was not blind to skill or social order outside Europe. He could recognize good cultivation, strong canoes, careful leadership, and disciplined communities. In that sense, he was a better observer than many of his contemporaries, but admiration did not remove the imbalance of the encounter. He still saw through the eyes of a British naval commander. He still measured usefulness. He still carried the mission northward in his mind. After Tonga, the voyage moved toward the Society Islands, and there the emotional centre of the public mission waited. Omai was to be returned. This was not a minor errand tucked into the corner of the voyage. Omai's presence had accompanied the expedition from England across the world. He had seen Britain, its cities, fashions, royal ceremonies, social rooms, and strange habits. He had lived as a celebrated guest, and now he was coming back to a Pacific world that had continued without him. Returning home after travel is often more difficult than leaving. The person who returns is changed, but home is not frozen in place to receive them. Omai came back with European objects, European associations, and a reputation altered by distance. To British eyes, perhaps he was being restored to his people. To the people of the Society Islands, the matter was more complicated. What did he now possess? What did his connection to Cook mean? Would he gain status? Would he become a target? Would his European goods make him powerful or vulnerable? A man cannot simply carry London in a chest and expect it to fit neatly beside old obligations. The ships reached Tahiti, familiar ground for Cook and for many British imaginations by then. Tahiti had already become one of the central places in European dreams of the Pacific. Warm, fertile, socially complex, and often described through a haze of fascination, it occupied a special place in the minds of those who read voyage accounts. But Tahiti was not a dream. It was a political society with rival chiefs, sacred spaces, labour, conflict, diplomacy, family obligations, and its own understanding of power. The Europeans often saw beauty first, because beauty is easy to notice when one arrives from a wooden ship with sore legs and a tired stomach. But beauty is not the same as simplicity. Tahiti also had a history with European ships by this time. Cook was not the first outsider to arrive, and his own earlier visits had already left traces. Metal goods had entered local exchange. Disease had entered too, though Europeans did not fully understand the consequences they carried. Relationships had formed between sailors and islanders, sometimes affectionate, sometimes transactional, sometimes exploitative, often difficult to categorize cleanly from far away. The islanders had learned things about European visitors. They knew the value of iron. They knew ships needed food. They knew sailors could be generous, foolish, dangerous, or desperate depending on the moment, and they knew that foreign captains might talk of friendship while insisting on their own rules. When Cook returned, he was not entering a fresh encounter. He was entering a place where expectations had been shaped by previous contact. That could help. People knew him. They knew something of his habits. Communication was easier than in a completely unfamiliar place. Some of the British had learned words of Tahitian or related languages. There were intermediaries, memories, routines of trade, but familiarity can also sharpen disappointment. A stranger's mistake may be excused as ignorance. A returning visitor's mistake may feel like disrespect. Omai's settlement became one of the delicate tasks. Cook did not simply drop him on a beach with a friendly wave and sail away, though that might have made for a shorter and much less awkward administrative process. He tried to establish him securely, particularly on Wahine. A house was built for him in a European style. Land was arranged through local chiefs. Goods were left. Animals were placed with him, including horses and other livestock. Weapons and tools formed part of what he carried into this new life. Cook seems to have wanted Omai to be protected and comfortable, but the arrangements show how limited European understanding could be. A house could be built in days. A stable place in society could not. Cook's carpenters could make walls, but they could not make Omai's authority secure. They could give him a visible structure, but not guarantee loyalty around it. They could leave animals, but not ensure they would thrive or fit local needs. They could leave tools, but not control how others desired them. Cook could use his prestige while present, but after the ships left, Omai would remain alone with the consequences. It is one of the sadder parts of the voyage, not because it is loud or bloody, but because it shows the gap between intention and result. Cook could cross oceans, but he could not build a future for another man by force of arrangement. The return of Omai also exposed the difference between performance and belonging. In Britain, Omai had been admired partly because he was out of place in an interesting way. He could be presented, dressed, painted, and discussed. In the Pacific, he had to live. He had to defend his goods, manage relationships, and hold his position among people who knew far more about the local world than any British officer did. A European house might impress visitors, but it might also mark him as strange. A musket might protect him, but it might also invite envy. A horse might be a marvel, but also a hungry marvel with hooves, which is not always the most convenient form of social stability. Meanwhile, the ships continued their necessary work. Food had to be acquired in large quantities. This often meant trade for pigs, fruit, roots, and other provisions. The islanders wanted iron, nails, cloth, beads, tools, and other objects. The exchange could be lively and successful. It could also become unstable when demand outran supply, or when sailors traded items they were not supposed to trade. Iron was especially dangerous in this way. A ship is full of metal, but not all of it is spare. Sailors were sometimes tempted to trade nails or pieces of equipment for food, favours, or relationships. A captain might issue orders. Sailors, being sailors, might discover personal interpretations of those orders, usually involving immediate appetite. This created a quiet internal tension aboard the ships. Cook needed to control trade not only with islanders but among his own men. Unauthorized trading could damage the ship and weaken discipline. It could also change relations ashore. If local people discovered that sailors would trade valuable metal secretly, then official exchange became harder to manage. The captain's authority leaked through small transactions. A nail here, a bit of iron there, a tool missing from the carpenter's stores, and suddenly the tidy system of naval command was being negotiated in the bushes behind a breadfruit tree. Sexual relationships added another layer of complication. European sailors and Pacific women had contact during many voyages, sometimes through systems of exchange, sometimes through personal attraction, sometimes under conditions shaped by power and misunderstanding. European accounts often describe these encounters through their own fantasies and judgments, while rarely preserving the full perspective of the women involved. For a ship's crew, such relationships could seem part of the release and pleasure of an island stop. For local societies, they could be tied to status, exchange, alliance, or conflict. They could also bring disease. The human body became another route by which the voyage changed the places it touched. Cook was aware that his men could cause trouble. He tried to regulate conduct, but regulation on paper and behaviour on shore were not the same thing. Men who had spent months under discipline might become difficult to control once they had land, food, company, and opportunity. Some were respectful, some were not. Some followed orders, some looked for ways around them. The islanders too had agency in these exchanges, but the consequences were not equal. European ships carried diseases, weapons, and future imperial interest. A brief encounter could leave a long trace. Still, the mood in Tahiti and the neighbouring islands was not simply dark. There were many moments of ease, curiosity and mutual pleasure. There were visits, gifts, meals, laughter, ceremonies and conversations. Cook was often received with respect. The ships could restock, the men could recover. The artist John Webber could draw scenes that would later feed European imagination. Naturalists could collect plants and describe animals. Officers could make observations and continue the patient work of turning the voyage into record. For a while, the expedition may have seemed to be doing exactly what it was meant to do. Moving through known Pacific relationships, managing obligations, returning Omai, gathering supplies, and preparing for the northern search. But beneath that surface, the voyage was beginning to carry a different feeling. The delays were not nothing. The negotiations took time. The livestock, gifts, and arrangements around Omai required attention. The need to secure provisions put pressure on trade. The season for the northern attempt could not be ignored. Cook had to be patient with island politics while thinking about ice thousands of miles away. That is not an easy mental balance. A commander under schedule pressure can begin to see local complications as obstacles, even when those complications are the normal life of the place he has entered. There were also signs in Cook himself that the final voyage would not simply repeat the earlier ones. Some accounts from the third voyage suggest a harsher edge in his behaviour compared with his previous reputation. He was still capable, still observant, still respected, but perhaps more easily angered. The reasons are not simple. He was older. He had been at sea for years across his career. The mission was difficult. His health may not have been perfect. The ships had been delayed. He had to manage public duties and secret objectives at the same time. None of this excuses cruelty or violence, but it helps explain how pressure can change the way command is exercised. A tired man with great authority is not always the safest instrument. In the Society Islands, Cook sometimes used force or threats to enforce order, as he had before. When goods were stolen, he pressed for their return. When cooperation failed, he could seize people or property. This tactic did not yet produce disaster, but it deepened the habit. In Cook's mind, he may have seen it as controlled coercion, a way to restore balance without greater bloodshed. But controlled coercion is still coercion, and it depends on the other side responding as expected. The danger comes when people do not respond as expected, or when the situation is more sacred, more political, or more volatile than the captain understands. The Pacific communities Cook visited were also learning. They learned that European captains prized certain objects intensely. They learned that theft could bring retaliation. They learned that hostages could be taken. They learned that ships could not remain forever, and that their need for food gave local suppliers leverage. They learned that European weapons were powerful but not magical. They learned that foreigners could be generous one day and violent the next. Every visit added to a growing body of local knowledge about how to deal with these arrivals. Again, the Europeans were not the only observers. Omai's eventual settlement on Wahine brought a kind of closure to the public part of the mission, though it was not a neat closure. Cook had done what he had been instructed to do. He had returned the famous visitor to the Pacific. He had tried to give him a foundation. He had left goods, animals, and a house. But the departure must have carried unease. Omai had become attached to some aboard the ship, and they to him. He had crossed worlds in a way few people ever had. Now he was left between them. The ships that had made him important sailed away. Whatever future he had would now depend on local realities Cook could no longer manage. There is a quiet emotional strain in that moment. Cook was not a sentimental writer in the modern sense, but even practical men can feel the weight of leave-taking. The beach, the house, the gifts, the animals, the crowd watching, the boats preparing to return to the ships, the final exchanges, the knowledge that this may be the last time. For Omai, the world of Britain was gone as soon as the sails moved offshore. For Cook, the last soft obligation of the voyage was complete. Ahead now lay the real object, the cold northern search that had been waiting beneath everything. The ships left the warm central Pacific carrying supplies, observations, and the marks of many encounters. They also carried the small injuries of those encounters, the irritations, thefts, punishments, misunderstandings, and memories that had not yet become a crisis, but had begun to show the voyage's weak points. The expedition had succeeded in practical terms. It had returned Omai. It had refreshed the ships. It had gathered food. It had renewed contact with important islands. It had seen Tonga's ceremonies and Tahiti's abundance. It had moved through the Pacific with the confidence of experience, yet confidence can hide strain. Cook's authority still held. The men still followed him. The ship still moved. But the voyage had already shown how easily scientific curiosity, trade, discipline, and force could become tangled. In Tonga, friendliness had carried political depth that Europeans did not fully grasp. In Tahiti and Wahine, welcome mixed with demand, affection with calculation, gift with burden, and homecoming with uncertainty. Omai's return, meant as a humane errand, revealed how difficult it was to move a human life across empires and then place it back where it began. The warm islands had not broken the expedition. They had shown the first hairline cracks. Now the tone of the voyage began to change with the latitude. The men had known green islands, crowded beaches, fruit, pigs, ceremonies, laughter, and uneasy bargaining. Soon they would know longer distances, colder air, and coastlines that did not offer breadfruit or easy anchorage. The hidden mission was no longer hidden from the shape of the route. The ships were turning toward the North Pacific, toward a region Cook had not mastered, toward waters where charts thinned and weather sharpened. The Pacific would widen around them again, not as the familiar island world of return visits, but as a road into something harder. Behind them lay Omai's house on Wahine, standing as a strange little piece of Europe in a Pacific landscape. Behind them lay Tongan hospitality, with its possible dangers folded beneath ceremony. Behind them lay Tahiti, where old familiarity had made some things easier and others more complicated. Ahead lay the long climb north, the search for unknown coasts, and the first meeting with the islands that Europeans would later call Hawaii. Cook did not yet know that those islands would become central to his fate. At this point, they were not in his memory. They were only somewhere ahead, beyond the next stretch of ocean, waiting in the path of a voyage that still believed its greatest danger would be ice. Once Omai had been left at Hua Hin, and the ships had taken on what supplies they could, the voyage began to lose the softer shape it had carried through the central Pacific. The errand of return was complete. The familiar islands were falling behind. The public kindness of bringing a man home had been done as well as Cook knew how to do it, though what would happen after the ships vanished over the horizon was no longer in his hands. Now the expedition turned toward its harder purpose. North. That simple word had been waiting beneath the whole voyage. North meant distance. North meant unfamiliar water. North meant colder weather, thinner charts, stranger coastlines, and the old unanswered question of the passage. For the men aboard Resolution and Discovery, the change would not have happened all at once. There was no dramatic line drawn across the sea where the warm Pacific suddenly became the unknown Pacific. The ship still rose and fell under the same sky. The watches continued. The sails were trimmed. The decks were cleaned. Meals were served. Men complained, as sailors are legally required to do by the invisible constitution of the sea. But the purpose had changed. They were no longer moving between places Cook already knew well. They were sailing toward a region that existed for them mostly as possibility. The North Pacific was not empty, and it was not unknown to the peoples who lived along its islands and coasts. But for Cook's expedition it was still uncertain. It had not yet been turned into the careful European knowledge Cook was famous for producing. A voyage like this depended on timing. The ships could not simply wander north whenever they pleased. They needed to reach high latitudes during the season when ice might allow movement. Too early and the cold would close them out. Too late, and they might lose the chance before it began. This meant that every week mattered. The long delays in the warmer islands, the care spent on Omai, the trouble of livestock, repairs, supplies and weather, all of it sat behind Cook now as time already used. Still, he had done what had to be done. The expedition was supplied, the ships were together, and the real search could begin. The Pacific ahead was vast in a way that even experienced sailors felt in their bones. This was not a neat ocean crossed in one confident line. It was a world of distances so large that land could disappear not just for days but for weeks. The horizon stayed round and empty. Birds became important because a bird might mean land or might mean nothing at all, because birds are not always considerate enough to carry little signs saying island nearby. Floating plants, changing swells, cloud shapes, currents, the colour of water, all could be noticed and discussed. Navigation depended on mathematics, instruments, skill and experience, but it also depended on paying attention to small signs. A ship in the 18th century did not have the luxury of being bored by nature. Boredom could be dangerous. The sea often gave its warnings quietly. Cook had sailed through huge stretches of the Pacific before, but this movement north carried a different kind of uncertainty. The expedition was entering an area where European knowledge was thin and scattered. Spanish ships had moved through parts of the eastern Pacific. Russian fur traders and explorers had reached across the northern Pacific from Siberia toward Alaska. Indigenous navigators, traders, fishers and coastal communities had their own knowledge of these waters in detail. But for Cook's British expedition, the ocean ahead remained a puzzle of reports, gaps, and possibilities. The maps did not yet speak with confidence. Then, in January 1778, land appeared where Cook had not expected to find such a major island group. The ships came upon the Hawaiian Islands, though Cook named them the Sandwich Islands, after the Earl of Sandwich, First Lord of the Admiralty. To Europeans aboard the expedition, this was a remarkable discovery in their own terms. They had reached a large inhabited island group in the North Pacific, one that was not on their charts. For the people of Hawaii, of course, nothing had been discovered in the same sense. Their islands were home. They had names, chiefs, farms, temples, fishing grounds, family lines, stories, boundaries, and sacred responsibilities. The ships did not reveal Hawaii to itself. They brought Hawaii into British maps. That first contact did not immediately carry the darkness that would later gather there. The ships approached Kauai and Niihau, and the encounters were cautious but largely peaceful. Canoes came out. People looked at the strangers and their vessels with interest and calculation. The Europeans saw skill, abundance, and what they often called friendliness. The Hawaiians saw ships unlike anything in their experience, filled with men who carried iron, cloth, tools, weapons, and habits that would have seemed both impressive and strange. Both sides were observing, both sides were testing. The beach and the ship became places where curiosity and caution stood very close together. One of the most striking features of the first Hawaiian encounters was the intensity of trade. Iron was again at the centre. To Cook's men, pieces of iron were useful but often ordinary. To island communities, iron was valuable because it could be worked into tools and weapons more durable than many existing materials. A nail could matter. A knife could matter more. An adze head could be a treasure. Cook and his officers tried to manage the exchange, but the demand was strong. Food, water, pigs, sweet potatoes, plantains and other supplies could be traded for pieces of European material. To sailors who had lived for months on shipboard provisions, this was extremely welcome. To the Hawaiians, the arrival of the ships opened access to goods that could shift local value and status. But trade always carries pressure. The ships needed provisions. The people ashore wanted iron. The captain wanted order. The sailors wanted food, pleasure, and private bargains. Chiefs wanted to understand and control the relationship. Ordinary people wanted what they could get. In such a setting, small problems were almost guaranteed. Something would be taken. Someone would misunderstand a bargain. A sailor would break rules, a local person would push advantage, a guard would overreact, a captain would demand return of property. Then everyone would have to decide whether the matter was finished or only beginning. During this first Hawaiian visit, the relationship did not yet break. Cook stayed only briefly, took on what he could, and moved on. The northern mission pressed too hard for a long stay. The ships had not come to settle into Hawaii. They had stumbled upon it on the way to the Arctic question. The islands were valuable as a place to refresh, but they were not yet the centre of the story. That would come later, when the ships returned damaged, tired, and surrounded by a very different set of circumstances. For now, Hawaii entered the expedition's journals as a major new finding, a useful supply point, and a place of great interest. It is strange to pause there, knowing what waits later. The first Hawaiian encounter had the quality of a doorway passed through without anyone understanding what room it led toward. The ships arrived, traded, observed, named, and departed. Cook could not know that the islands would draw him back. The Hawaiians could not know that this brief meeting would soon be followed by a more intense return, filled with ceremony, strain, and violence. History often gives later readers a cruel advantage. We can see the shape forming before the people inside it can. They see a day's work. We see a warning. After leaving Hawaii, Cook pressed north and east toward the coast of North America. The weather changed as the ships climbed into higher latitudes. Warm island air gave way to colder winds. Clothes changed. Men who had grown used to trading under bright skies now faced wet decks, fog, and chill. The sea itself seemed to become less forgiving. In the Central Pacific, danger might come from reefs, misunderstandings, disease, or shortage. In the north, danger also came from cold water, storms, poor visibility, and lee shores where a ship could be driven toward land before anyone had time for a proper prayer or even a badly organised one. The North American coast was not a simple line waiting to be traced. It was broken, forested, mountainous, and weather-heavy. The expedition reached the coast in the region of what is now Oregon, then moved northward. Cook had to work with incomplete information, poor weather, and difficult currents. A coast seen through fog is an unfriendly subject for careful charting. Land appears, vanishes, doubles itself in cloud, and refuses to sit still in the mind. Mountains show above mist while the dangerous shore below remains hidden. The ship's lead gives depths, but depths change. A bay might be safe or might be a trap. A promising opening might lead nowhere. A captain searching for a passage had to consider every inlet without losing the season to every temptation. This was the difficult work Cook knew so well. Observe, measure, record, check, continue. A coastline did not become useful to European navigation simply because it was seen. It had to be fixed in relation to latitude and longitude. Its hazards had to be noted. Its anchorages had to be tested if possible. The shape of headlands, islands and channels had to be placed on paper, with enough care that future ships could trust the result. Cook's genius lay partly in this patience. He was not merely chasing a rumour of a passage, he was producing knowledge as he went, even when the passage refused to appear. The ships eventually entered Nootka Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, though Cook first thought it might be something else and gave names according to his understanding at the time. There they found a sheltered place for repairs, trade, and observation. The communities of the region, including the New Charnolth people, had their own rich coastal culture, maritime skill, trade networks, and social systems. The arrival of Cook's ships brought another intense encounter between European needs and indigenous power. The British needed rest, wood, water, and repair. The people ashore saw opportunity, risk, and strange visitors with valuable materials. The trading at Nootka Sound revealed something that would become enormously important after Cook's voyage: sea otter pelts. The expedition's men obtained furs from the local people, often without fully understanding at first how valuable those pelts would become in trade with China. Later, when the surviving expedition reached Canton, the high prices paid for sea otter skins would help ignite a fur trade that changed the Pacific Northwest. That future was not yet visible in full at Nootka, but its beginnings were there in the exchange of goods, the feel of pelts, the careful bargaining between people with very different ideas of value. One side saw useful trade goods and local products. The other side was about to help open a commercial rush that would bring many more ships. Again, discovery and consequence sat close together. A pelt traded in a quiet inlet could become part of a future wave of commerce, violence, disease, competition, and transformation. Cook was not a fur trader by profession, and his mission was not to establish that trade. But expeditions often discover profits by accident. Someone notices what sells, someone tells someone else. A chart makes return easier. A rumour becomes a voyage becomes a business becomes a new pressure on the people and animals of a region. History does not need a grand announcement to change direction. Sometimes it begins with men comparing prices and looking suddenly very interested. Nootka also gave the expedition a chance to observe a world very different from the tropical Pacific societies the men had recently visited. The climate, clothing, houses, canoes, food and material culture were different. The British saw large wooden houses, carved objects, skilled woodworking, and people accustomed to life along a cold, rich coast. The sea here was not a wide, empty road between coral islands. It was a local storehouse, highway and boundary. Canoes moved through waters that their makers understood intimately. The Europeans may have had larger ships and guns, but they did not have local knowledge. In a place like Nootka, that mattered. Cook and his officers watched, recorded, and sometimes misunderstood. They described what they saw with the language available to them, filtered through European assumptions. Some observations were careful, others were limited. The people they encountered were not there to explain themselves fully for British science. They had trade to manage, social rules to maintain, curiosity to satisfy, and reasons to be cautious. A meeting like this could produce pages of European description and still leave the deepest local meanings unrecorded. The stay was useful but not restful in any full sense. Repairs were made, but repair work at sea is simply another kind of labour. Wood had to be cut, rigging attended to, leaks addressed, supplies arranged. The men were far from home, and the voyage ahead remained uncertain. Cook was still hunting for the opening that would lead toward the Atlantic. Every inlet along the coast carried the possibility of disappointment. A captain searching for a passage must repeatedly raise hope, and then lower it again. That is mentally tiring. It is not the clean failure of a wall directly in front of you. It is the slow irritation of many doors, each of which might open and most of which do not. Moving northward from the Pacific coast, the expedition entered colder and more complex waters. Alaska and the Aleutian world lay ahead, shaped by indigenous communities and by Russian expansion from the west. Here Cook was not entering a region untouched by outside empire. Russian traders and explorers had already been moving through the northern Pacific, especially in pursuit of fur. The world Cook approached was therefore not simply unknown in an absolute sense. It was unknown to the British in detail, partially known through reports, and deeply known by the native peoples who lived there. It was also a zone where imperial interests were beginning to overlap. This overlap mattered because Cook's voyage was not just a scientific expedition moving through empty geography. It was a British entry into a northern Pacific world where Russia had already established presence and knowledge. The search for the passage had a strategic edge. If Britain could understand the coast and perhaps find a route through to the Atlantic, it could strengthen its position in global navigation and trade. Maps in this region were not innocent. They were tools in a competition among empires, even when drawn by careful men with cold hands and honest instruments. The farther north the ships went, the more the voyage became a test of endurance. Fog thickened, winds shifted. The coastline became a problem of bays, islands, headlands and inlets. The men had to remain alert in conditions that made alertness unpleasant. Cold damp gets into everything: clothes, bedding, rope, wood, mood. A tropical island stop could be difficult, but at least it might offer warmth and fresh fruit. Northern surveying offered cold fingers, uncertain bearings, and the thrilling possibility of being wet in several different ways at once. There was also the matter of health. Cook had long been admired for preserving his crews from scurvy and maintaining shipboard discipline. But no routine could make men immune to exhaustion. Long voyages wore people down. The body could survive while the mind became tired. Discipline could hold while tempers shortened. Officers could still perform their duties while privately wishing the coastline would become less complicated, and perhaps draw itself for once. The expedition was still functioning, but the northern work demanded constant attention. Cook himself was under increasing strain. He had to decide which openings deserved investigation and which should be passed. This was not simple. Ignore a promising inlet, and you might miss the passage. Spend too long exploring every inlet, and the season might vanish. The pressure of the hidden mission became sharp here. In the Central Pacific, delays were frustrating but manageable. In the north, delay could defeat the purpose of the voyage. Ice and weather would not wait. The calendar was as much an enemy as any storm. The search for the Northwest Passage required imagination and restraint at the same time. Imagination, because Cook had to believe that one of these waterways might lead through the continent. Restraint, because he could not chase every false hope indefinitely. A lesser commander might have wasted time on fantasies. Cook was usually practical. He wanted evidence. He watched the direction of channels, the movement of tides, the character of water, the shape of land. But even practical men can feel the pull of a possibility when a lifetime of reputation has brought them to that very edge. Northward movement also meant encounters with coastal peoples whose lives were shaped by different conditions from the island societies earlier in the voyage. Along the northwest coast and into Alaska, communities had developed technologies, houses, clothing, and food systems suited to cold marine environments. They were not waiting helplessly at the margins of the map. They had their own forms of wealth, hierarchy, ceremony and trade. They had knowledge of currents, animals, seasons and coastal routes that the British lacked. The Europeans could describe them, trade with them, fear them, or admire them, but they could not honestly call them simple. The British often measured difference through comparison. A canoe might be judged against another canoe seen in Tonga. Clothing might be compared with European clothing. Houses might be described as crude or impressive depending on the observer's expectations. But the usefulness of an object depends on its world. A thick cloak in cold rain is not inferior to light cloth in Tahiti. It belongs to another climate. A large cedar canoe is not a curiosity. It is a solution to a local problem refined by long experience. Cook's men could see skill, but they did not always understand the systems behind it. At times, the expedition's movement along the coast must have felt like entering a series of rooms without knowing the language spoken in each one. Trade might begin with gestures. Misunderstanding might be corrected by trial and error. Iron again mattered, but so did beads, cloth, and other goods. The British needed local food less desperately than in the tropical islands at certain moments, but they needed water, wood, and information. The people ashore might want metal, but they also wanted to control the terms of contact. A large ship could impress, but it was also vulnerable. It needed anchorage. It needed time. It needed men to go ashore. Power at sea did not automatically become control on land. In this northern stretch, the expedition's great ambition met the physical reality of geography. The coast did not offer an obvious open road. It offered complexity. Cook's task became partly the elimination of possibilities. This bay was not the passage. That inlet did not lead through. This stretch of coast bent in the wrong direction. That opening was blocked, shallow, or uncertain. The work of exploration is often remembered for what it finds, but much of it is the patient recording of what is not there. It is the art of being disappointed carefully. There is a kind of weariness in that. Each correction improves the map but narrows the hope. Each sound taken, each point fixed, each inlet dismissed, brings knowledge and reduces possibility. The men were making progress, but progress toward what? Not yet the passage, not yet the triumph that could crown Cook's career. Instead, the voyage produced coastlines, names, contacts, observations, and a growing sense that the land and ice ahead would not easily give up the route Britain wanted. Still, the expedition continued. Cook had not built his reputation by turning back at the first discouragement. He had crossed the Antarctic Circle. He had circumnavigated New Zealand. He had traced dangerous coasts. He had endured uncertainty before. The men aboard knew this. Their confidence in him was practical, not decorative. They had seen his skill. A sailor trusts a captain not because of speeches, but because the captain keeps the ship off rocks, finds water, manages weather, and knows when to press on. Cook had done these things again and again. In the North Pacific, that trust still mattered. But a voyage is not held together by skill alone. It is held together by morale, health, discipline, purpose, and the belief that hardship is leading somewhere. The farther north they went, the more the men faced the uncomfortable possibility that the great hidden mission might become a record of frustration. The Northwest Passage had ruined hopes before. Now it waited ahead, not as a shining prize, but as a cold question wrapped in fog. The unknown Pacific was beginning to change Cook's story. In the Central Islands, he had been the returning master navigator, known, respected, sometimes resisted, but operating in seas he understood. In Hawaii, he had become the first European visitor to a world that would soon matter deeply to him. Along the North American coast, he became again the surveyor, careful and demanding, pushing his ships through weather and uncertainty. With each mile north, the voyage moved away from the kind of discovery that brings immediate delight and toward the kind that tests patience. The ocean was no longer offering green islands and full canoes. it was offering cold evidence. And yet, there was greatness in this stage too. Not the easy greatness of a dramatic landing or a single moment that paintings can love, but the harder greatness of disciplined work. Cook and his crews were bringing the North Pacific coast into a clearer European map. They were recording places, peoples, resources and routes. They were moving through waters where British ships had not previously operated with such purpose. Their observations would matter to future navigation. Their mistakes would matter too. The voyage was still an enormous act of endurance and skill, even as it carried within it the pressures that would later darken the story. Behind them, Hawaii remained like a note written in the margin. Important, but not yet understood. Ahead, Alaska and the Bering Strait waited with ice, the real judge of the mission. The ships moved on into colder seas, carrying fresh memories of Hawaiian trade, Nootka exchanges, North American forests, and the constant labour of charting. Cook's mind remained fixed on the opening he had been sent to find. Somewhere, perhaps, there was a channel. Somewhere the Pacific might narrow, bend, and lead into the long-sought passage. Or perhaps the map would end in a white wall. The men could not know yet which it would be. They only knew the ship's motion, the cold air, the watches, the fog, the orders, the creak of timber, and the familiar figure of Cook still pressing forward. The warm islands were gone now. The voyage had entered its harder climate, not only in weather but in spirit. The expedition was no longer moving through the Pacific of return and supply. It was moving through the Pacific of uncertainty, where every coastline might matter, every delay might cost the season, and every mile north brought them closer to the place where ambition would meet ice. The farther Cook pushed into the northern Pacific, the more the voyage became a contest with weather, distance, and the calendar. The warm island world was now far behind the ships. The men were no longer bargaining for pigs under palm trees, or watching crowded canoes move across bright water. They were sailing through colder seas, along coasts that were difficult to read, under skies that could close without warning. The work was still exploration, but it had lost much of its earlier comfort. A coastline in the north did not welcome a tired crew in the same way a fertile island might. It gave them fog, hard wind, uncertain anchorages, and the constant problem of deciding whether a shadow ahead was land, cloud, or the beginning of a very bad afternoon. Cook's task was simple to describe and very hard to carry out. He had to trace the northwest coast of North America and search for any opening that might lead eastward through the continent. If such a passage existed, it would not announce itself politely. It might look like a bay at first. It might hide behind islands. It might appear as a channel that turned inland. Or it might not exist in any usable form at all. Cook had to keep testing the coast without wasting the brief season in which northern waters could be approached. This was the kind of problem that sounds straightforward on a desk and becomes maddening on a ship. In these waters, hope could be created by a bend in the land. A wide inlet could make officers lean over charts with new attention. A strong tide might suggest a channel leading somewhere important. A gap between headlands could make a man wonder if this, finally, was the entrance to the long-sought road. Then the ship would investigate, and the hope would narrow. The water might become shallow. The land might close. The channel might turn into a bay. Another possibility would be crossed off. Cook's map improved, but the dream did not come closer. This is one of the quiet difficulties of exploration. It is not always the dramatic danger that wears men down. Sometimes it is disappointment repeated in careful detail. Each false lead requires labour. Boats may be sent out. Soundings taken, bearings written down, weather endured. Officers compare notes. The captain decides. Then the ship moves on. Everyone has learned something useful, but not the thing they came to find. The Northwest Passage remained less like a doorway and more like a rumour that kept stepping backward. As the expedition moved north, the influence of Russia became more noticeable. Russian traders and explorers had long been active in the far northern Pacific, moving eastward from Siberia through the Aleutian Islands and into Alaska. Their interest was strongly tied to the fur trade, especially sea otters and other valuable skins. Cook was not entering a blank region. He was entering a place where indigenous peoples had lived for generations, and where another European empire had already begun to leave marks. The Northern Pacific was not empty space waiting for Britain. It was already a zone of local knowledge, regional trade, violence, adaptation, and imperial competition. The indigenous communities of Alaska and the Aleutian region knew these seas in ways Cook did not. They knew the animals, currents, storms, islands, and seasons. They knew where to fish, where to hunt, when to travel, and when to stay ashore. Their boats, clothing, tools, and shelters were shaped by cold water and hard weather. To British eyes, many of these things were unfamiliar, but unfamiliar did not mean primitive. A kayak or skin boat made for northern seas was not a lesser craft because it looked different from a European longboat. It was a local solution to a local world. In some situations, it was far better suited to the water than anything Cook's ships could lower from the davits. Cook's men observed these communities with curiosity. They traded when they could. They recorded clothing, tools, houses, weapons, boats, and ornaments. They tried to understand what materials people used and how they moved through the landscape. Some encounters were cautious, some were practical, some involved gestures, bargaining, and the usual uncertainty of meeting people whose language and customs were not yet understood. Metal goods again became important. Iron, knives, beads, cloth, and other European objects could be exchanged for food, furs, information, or local items. But here, as elsewhere, trade was not just shopping with better scenery. It was a negotiation of power. The British had large ships and firearms. The local communities had knowledge, resources, and the ability to choose how much contact to allow. A ship could intimidate from the water, but it still needed anchorage, repair, and supplies. Men had to go ashore. Boats had to approach beaches. Crews depended on local conditions. Cook had to remain aware that European power had limits, especially in a place where a storm, a reef, or a hostile shore could make even a well-commanded vessel vulnerable. The physical conditions grew more demanding as the expedition approached Alaska. Fog was a constant enemy of certainty. A navigator can calculate with care, but fog can reduce the world to damp grey confusion. Land might be close without being visible. Ice might appear suddenly. A current might set the ship toward danger while no one could see enough to judge the distance. The lead line became vital, dropping into cold water to find depth. Watches had to be kept with care. Sails had to be managed in shifting wind. A moment of inattention could place the ship in a dangerous position. The men had to work in cold, wet conditions that made every task slower. Rope stiffened, hands numbed, clothing stayed damp. Cooking, sleeping, standing watch, repairing gear, and keeping notes all became less pleasant. It is easy to admire a great expedition from a dry chair. It is harder to remember that the men inside it were often cold, tired, and uncomfortable, and that they still had to keep doing exact work. A chart made in such conditions is not merely a drawing. It is the record of disciplined attention under strain. Cook had known difficult weather before. He had sailed into Antarctic waters on his second voyage and had seen ice in the far south, but the northern mission carried a particular pressure because it was tied to one specific question. The passage had to be tested. The northern coast had to be searched. A failure here would not be a side result. It would be the central result. Cook could return with excellent maps and observations, but if he did not find the passage, the great hope of the voyage would remain unfulfilled. Still, he kept going. He explored the coast, named features, checked inlets, and pushed farther. The ships moved through the Gulf of Alaska and toward the Aleutian chain, then into the region of the Bering Sea. This was far from the comfortable image of exploration, as a series of pleasant landings and grand announcements. The work was slow, technical, and often unpleasant. Every mile carried the risk of ice, storm, grounding, or damage. The ships themselves were aging under the strain. Resolution had already served Cook on the second voyage and had been refitted, but refitted did not mean new. Wooden ships lived hard lives. They leaked, strained, and needed constant attention. Discovery too had to endure the same cold, rough work. A ship in these waters was not just a vehicle, it was shelter, workshop, storehouse, hospital and prison. If it failed, everything failed. The men could not step out and wait for help. There was no rescue service beyond the courage and skill of the other ship, and even that depended on weather and distance. Cook's command therefore required caution as much as boldness. He had to push far enough to fulfill the mission, but not so recklessly that he trapped both ships in ice or damaged them beyond repair. The difference between determination and ruin could be a single decision made in poor visibility. The expedition eventually reached the Bering Strait, the narrow sea passage between Asia and North America. This was the crucial region. If a route existed around the top of the continent, the way north and east would have to be found somewhere beyond these waters. The ships had reached the edge of the Great Question. They had crossed the world to stand before it. After all the months of sailing, all the island stops, all the repairs and delays, all the careful charting, they were now where the secret mission had been pointing from the beginning. And there they met ice. Not a poetic idea of ice. Not a distant whiteness on the horizon, useful for a dramatic description. Real ice. Heavy, dangerous, blocking ice. Ice that could stop a wooden ship more completely than any army. Ice that shifted, pressed, ground and closed. Ice that did not care about imperial ambition, scientific curiosity, or the reputation of Captain Cook. A ship might survive storms by skill and luck. It might survive reefs by careful sounding and sharp eyes. But pack ice was different. It was a moving wall, a crushing field, a slow weapon made of cold. Cook pushed north as far as he could. The ships reached high latitude, but the way was blocked. There was no open channel leading eastward, no clear northern road, no practical passage. The Arctic ice made the decision that Cook had hoped to make for himself. The expedition could not force its way through. To continue recklessly would risk the ships and the lives of the crews. Cook was brave, but he was not foolish enough to treat ice as if it could be argued with. The ships turned back. That turn must have carried a heavy silence, even if daily work continued as usual. Orders were still given, sails were still handled, meals still prepared, men still joked, cursed, and worked. But the central dream of the voyage had met its answer, at least for that season. The passage was not found. The northern coast had not opened. The expedition had done what it could, and what it could do was not enough. For Cook, this must have been a bitter result. He had not failed through incompetence. He had been stopped by geography and ice. But a captain's mind does not always accept that kind of distinction easily. He had crossed the world for this, and the sea had refused him. The dream of the Northwest Passage had always contained a misunderstanding. Europeans imagined it as a route, but the Arctic was not simply a locked door waiting for a key. It was a changing system of ice, weather, currents, shallow seas, islands and seasons. A passage could exist on a map and still be almost unusable for the ships and trade ambitions of the 18th century. Later centuries would prove that routes through the Arctic did exist, but existence was not the same as practical access. Cook was searching with wooden ships, canvas sails, limited heating, no engines, no modern ice charts, and no ability to break through pack ice. His ships were strong, but they were not built to conquer the Arctic. This is important because the failure of the passage search was not a small failure of navigation. It was the collision between European commercial desire and polar reality. The Admiralty wanted a route. Merchants wanted shorter voyages. Geographers wanted the map solved. Cook wanted to complete his task. The ice gave the same answer to all of them. Not here, not now, not with these ships. yet the expedition had achieved a great deal in reaching that point. Cook's work helped clarify the northern Pacific and the western coast of North America for European maps. His observations contributed to understanding the limits of navigation in the region. He confirmed, by direct attempt, that the route he was sent to find could not be used in the way Britain hoped, at least under those conditions. This was valuable knowledge, even if it lacked the satisfaction of triumph. In practical exploration, discovering that a thing cannot be done is still discovery. It just receives fewer cheers and rather less cake. After turning back from the ice, Cook had to decide what came next. The ships could not remain indefinitely in northern waters. Winter would make the region more dangerous. The men and vessels needed rest, repair, and supplies. The plan was to return south, spend the winter in a safer and warmer place, and attempt the northern search again the following year. This was sensible. It was also exhausting. The voyage would not end. The failure at the ice did not release them. It simply postponed the question and extended the burden. Imagine the emotional effect of that. The men had crossed the world, reached the edge of the Arctic, been blocked, and now had to sail thousands of miles south to prepare to try again. There was no quick return to England, no immediate relief, no simple conclusion. The voyage stretched onward. The same routines would continue, the same cramped spaces, the same command structure, the same worn ships, the same captain carrying the same unfinished mission. Even for disciplined sailors, this must have felt heavy. The northern attempt had also placed Cook under a new kind of pressure. He had to maintain authority after the expedition's main goal had been frustrated. Success can strengthen command. Clear failure can weaken it if men begin to doubt the purpose of continued hardship. Cook's reputation remained strong, but reputation does not keep a crew endlessly cheerful. He needed to keep the ships functioning, the officers aligned, the men disciplined, and the next plan credible. A commander cannot simply say, "The ice disagreed with us, so let us all feel gloomy for several months." He must turn disappointment into orders. The return south also meant that the expedition needed a winter harbour. Cook knew now of the Hawaiian Islands, which lay conveniently in the central North Pacific. When he first encountered them, they had been unexpected. Now they became useful. They offered food, water, repair opportunities, and a climate far kinder than Alaska. The ships would go back to Hawaii, not as brief visitors on the way north, but as tired vessels needing rest after a failed Arctic attempt. This difference matters. The first visit had been short. The next would be longer and more intense. The relationship would be changed by need. Before that return, however, the expedition continued to move through northern waters and maintain contact with the wider region. There were encounters with Russian traders and officials in the Aleutian area, where Cook's men could gather information and compare knowledge. This must have been a striking moment. British explorers at the far northern edge of the Pacific meeting the reach of Russia coming from the opposite direction. The map was closing from both sides. What had once seemed distant and separate was becoming connected by ships, trade, and imperial curiosity. For Cook, Russian information could be useful, but it also reminded him that Britain was not alone in the northern Pacific. Other Europeans had their own ambitions and their own networks. The sea otter trade, the position of Alaska, the route toward Asia, and the possibility of an Arctic passage all carried strategic meaning. The Northwest Passage was not only a line on a chart, it was part of a larger struggle over routes, resources, and influence. The crews may not have thought in such grand terms every day. A sailor's concerns were often more immediate. Was the food decent? Was the weather worsening? Was the watch cold? Were the sails secure? Was the captain angry? Would there be fresh provisions soon? Could a man sleep without being shaken awake for another duty? But even ordinary sailors could understand disappointment. They knew they had not found the passage. They knew they were not going home yet. They knew the voyage would continue into another year. The body can obey long after enthusiasm has gone missing. Cook's health and temper during this period have drawn attention from historians because the later events of the voyage suggest a man under increasing strain. It is difficult to diagnose the dead from a distance, and it is unwise to turn every harsh action into a medical theory. But it is fair to say that Cook was no longer a young officer proving himself. He was 50 years old after years of hard voyaging, commanding 2 ships through one of the most demanding expeditions of the age. He carried responsibility for men, ships, science, secret orders, diplomatic encounters, and his own reputation. That strain did not vanish when the ice stopped him. It followed him south. The blocked passage may have affected him deeply. Cook had built his career on solving geographical problems. He had proved that New Zealand was not part of a southern continent. He had shown that the imagined temperate terra australis did not exist in the way Europeans hoped. He had charted coastlines with remarkable accuracy. Now he had reached a problem that could not be solved by discipline alone. No amount of careful observation could make the ice open. No command could turn the Arctic into a trade route. For a man used to forcing uncertainty into order, this was a hard lesson. The Arctic also changed the expedition's sense of scale. The Pacific had seemed immense, but the North added another kind of vastness. Empty seas, low temperatures, fog, ice, and long coasts made human plans feel small. The men were not simply crossing distance, they were encountering limits. Limits of season, limits of ship design, limits of European knowledge, limits of command. A captain can control a crew but not a climate. He can measure a coast but not make it useful. He can name a cape but not make the water beyond it open. There is a quiet dignity in the decision to turn back, even if it disappointed the mission. Recklessness can look heroic in stories, but at sea it often produces wreckage. Cook understood that survival mattered. He did not throw the ships against the ice for the sake of pride. He withdrew, planning to return when conditions might be better. That was the rational decision. Yet rational decisions do not always feel good. They can taste like defeat while being the only responsible choice. As the ships headed away from the Arctic, the dream of the passage remained unfinished. It had not died completely, but it had changed. It was no longer the bright hidden prize pulling them forward from England. It had become a failed attempt, a problem postponed, a burden to be carried into the next season. The expedition had entered the north with the possibility of one of the greatest discoveries in navigation. It left with charts, observations, experience and disappointment. That is a respectable result in historical terms. It may not have felt respectable to the men who still had to live through the rest of the voyage. The decision to winter in Hawaii now became practical. The islands were known. They were well placed between the northern coast and the broader Pacific. They could provide food and rest. Cook had reason to believe that relations there could be managed. The first encounter had been peaceful enough. Trade had been possible. The people had shown interest and generosity. For a tired expedition, Hawaii seemed to offer what Alaska could not: warmth, provisions, repairs, and a pause before another attempt on the ice. But the ships that returned to Hawaii were not the same ships that had first arrived there. They were more worn, the men were more tired. The mission had been frustrated. Cook himself may have been carrying greater irritation and disappointment. Need changes the tone of a visit. A brief stop can remain light. A long stay for repair and provisioning places heavier demands on local resources and patience. The Hawaiians, too, would not experience the second arrival as a simple repeat of the first. They had already seen these ships. They had learned from the earlier contact. Their own religious, political and seasonal circumstances would shape the reception in ways Cook did not fully understand. So the failure at the ice points directly toward the tragedy to come, not because the Arctic caused it in a simple way, but because it sent the expedition southward, tired, delayed, and still unfinished. The Northwest Passage remained out of reach. The ships needed recovery. The captain needed supplies and control. The crews needed relief. Hawaii stood in their path as the most useful harbour in the central North Pacific. What had been an unexpected discovery became a necessary refuge. As resolution and discovery moved back toward warmer waters, the Great Northern Dream did not vanish behind them. It stayed aboard, stored in the captain's mind with the charts and orders. The men would rest, repair, and then try again. That was the plan. But plans made after failure often carry a different weight. They are less fresh. They have less room for error. They depend more heavily on people who are already tired. The expedition had survived Alaska and the ice, but survival is not the same as renewal. The sea began to change again as they sailed south. The air would soften, the cold would loosen its grip. The thought of fresh food and easier anchorage must have lifted spirits. Men who had shivered near the ice could look forward to the green slopes of Hawaii, to trade, fruit, warmth, and the relief of being somewhere that did not seem determined to freeze the rigging. It would be natural for them to imagine the return as a welcome pause, a place to recover before the next northern attempt, a place where the expedition could regain strength. That is how tragedy often approaches in history, not wearing its final shape, not announced by thunder. It comes through practical decisions that make sense at the time. The ships need repair. The crew needs food. The season is wrong for the Arctic. The islands are near enough. The earlier visit went well enough. Go back. Rest. Prepare. Try again. And so Cook turned toward Hawaii, carrying the failure of the Northwest Passage behind him and the hope of another attempt ahead. He had reached the edge of the Arctic and been stopped. He had not lost his ships. He had not abandoned the mission. He was still in command. But something in the voyage had tightened. The expedition now depended on a long stay among people whose world Cook had only briefly touched, in a place where his arrival would be interpreted through meanings he did not fully grasp, at a moment when his own patience and authority were already under strain. The ice had refused him in the north. The next test would come in warmth on a crowded shore, where the problem would not be frozen water, but human misunderstanding. When the ships came back toward Hawaii, they were not arriving as fresh visitors with a clean horizon ahead of them. They were returning after cold, frustration, and a northern season that had refused to open. The dream of the Northwest Passage had not been destroyed, but it had been delayed, and delay at sea is never just delay. It becomes tired bodies, worn rigging, damp bedding, repairs postponed and then made urgent, officers calculating what can still be done, and sailors quietly measuring the distance between themselves and home. Resolution and Discovery were still under command, still working, still capable, but they carried the marks of the Arctic attempt. They needed rest, they needed food, they needed water, they needed wood, they needed a place where men could breathe warmer air and stop looking at ice. Hawaii offered all of that, at least from the British point of view. The islands had appeared earlier like a gift placed in the middle of the North Pacific, large, fertile, populated, and well positioned between the northern Search and the wider ocean. Cook had not planned his whole voyage around them, because he had not known they were there. But once found, they became important almost immediately. A captain looking at a map thinks in terms of harbours, supplies, distance, and season. Hawaii sat in the right place, and that made it useful. Useful places attract returning ships. Returning ships change useful places. The men aboard must have felt relief as the air warmed. Cold water and high-latitude fog gave way to softer conditions. The smell of land would have come before the full shape of it could be properly understood. Green slopes, canoes, surf, smoke, fields, and people. After the north, the islands must have seemed almost unreal in their abundance. Fresh food mattered more after cold hardship. A pig, a bundle of sweet potatoes, a calabash of water, a coconut, a place to anchor, all of these could feel like blessings when a ship had been living too long on the hard routine of preserved supplies. Even the most disciplined sailor could be forgiven for looking at the shore and thinking less of imperial geography and more of dinner. But the return was not simply a matter of tired Europeans arriving in a peaceful paradise. Hawaii was not an empty refuge. It was a powerful, organised island world with chiefs, priests, farmers, warriors, craftspeople, fishers, sacred rules, political rivalries, and ceremonies that shaped public life. The ships entered that world at a particular time, under conditions Cook did not fully understand. It was the season of Makahiki, a period associated with the god Lono, with harvest, tribute, games, processions, and a temporary suspension or softening of certain forms of warfare. This mattered deeply. It shaped how the Hawaiians saw the arrival of the ships, how ceremonies unfolded, how people gathered, and how Cook himself was received. The connection between Cook and Lono has been debated for a long time. Older accounts often said that Hawaiians believed Cook was the god Lono himself. Later, historians and scholars have treated that idea more carefully, pointing out that Hawaiian thought, ritual, politics, and ceremony were more complex than a simple mistake. Cook may have been received in ways associated with Lono. He may have been placed within a sacred pattern because of the timing of his arrival, the form of his ships, the direction of travel, and the ceremonies already underway. But that does not mean everyone simply lost the ability to distinguish a hungry British captain from a deity. Human societies are rarely that simple, and Hawaiian society certainly was not. People could act within ritual meanings while also watching the visitors as political and practical beings. They could honour, test, trade, admire, and doubt at the same time. Cook's ships entered Kealakekua Bay on the island of Hawaii in January 1779. The bay was an important place, not just a convenient anchorage. It was connected with sacred and political life, and during Makahiki, the arrival of the ships took on unusual significance. Canoes came in great numbers, people gathered in large crowds, chiefs and priests became involved. The British were met with formal attention, gifts and ceremonies that impressed them deeply, even when they did not fully understand what they were seeing. For sailors used to rough weather and practical hardship, the scale of welcome must have been astonishing. Food came in abundance. Pigs, fruit, vegetables and other provisions were brought to the ships, the bay filled with movement. At first, the return seemed successful, perhaps even triumphant. Cook, the famous navigator, had come back from the edge of the Arctic and found a wintering place rich enough to restore his expedition. The Hawaiians brought supplies in such quantities that the British could believe their presence was welcomed without strain. The officers observed ceremonies, Weber sketched, men traded. The ships were repaired and watered. The expedition found for a while what it needed. After ice and fog, this must have felt like release. Still, a large welcome can hide tension. Feeding 2 British ships and their crews was not a small matter. The supplies given or traded came from local labour, local fields, local stores, and local systems of tribute. The British saw abundance because abundance was presented to them. That did not mean there was no cost. A crew at anchor eats every day. A ship needing repair takes wood, water, space, and attention. Hundreds or thousands of local people gathering around foreign vessels also changes ordinary life. Curiosity itself can become labour. Watching strangers is work when those strangers are armed, unpredictable, and full of objects people want. The British also brought their own disorder. Sailors traded. Some obeyed regulations, others found ways around them. Iron moved from ship to shore in controlled and uncontrolled ways. Nails, tools, and bits of metal were again valuable. Hawaiian people, like other Pacific communities, quickly understood the importance of iron. It could be shaped into blades, fishhooks, tools, and weapons. The British needed to preserve the working metal of their vessels. This created the same old problem in a new place. One side saw opportunity, the other saw loss. A nail might be small enough to slip away in a hand, but on a ship, enough missing nails begin to feel like a personal attack on civilization, or at least on the carpenter's patience. The length of the stay increased pressure. Short visits can remain festive, long visits reveal habits. The first days may be full of gifts, ceremony, laughter, and curiosity. After that come shortages, irritations, thefts, jealousies, misunderstandings, and fatigue. The British remained outsiders, but they were outsiders who needed things constantly. The Hawaiians remained hosts and traders, but their patience was not endless. A visiting ship is interesting. 2 visiting ships staying long enough to consume supplies and disturb routines become something else. Cook's role during this stay was unusually difficult. In one sense, he was honoured. He received formal treatment that seemed to place him in a position of great significance. In another sense, he needed to keep strict control over his men and the expedition's practical needs. Sacred respect did not remove the demands of command. He still had to get food aboard, organise repairs, preserve discipline, and prepare for another northern attempt. If Hawaiians treated him through ritual forms he did not fully grasp, that could create danger. A man may be honoured in one system while trying to operate inside another. Cook may have believed he understood the main terms of the relationship well enough. The trouble was that enough is a fragile word. For the Hawaiians, the ships and their captain may have fitted into the Makahiki season in powerful ways, but that season would not last forever. Ritual time changes. Ceremonial welcome does not mean permanent permission. As the days passed, the context shifted. What had been appropriate at one moment could become inappropriate later. The British, following their own schedule of repairs and supply, may not have understood how the meaning of their presence altered as the season moved. They saw practical continuity. The ships arrived, anchored, repaired, provisioned, and prepared to leave. Hawaiian society may have seen a changing ritual and political situation in which the visitor's role was not fixed in the simple way the Europeans assumed. This is one reason the phrase paradise is so dangerous in stories of Pacific exploration. It flattens living places into scenery. It makes hunger invisible because fruit is visible. It makes politics disappear behind sunlight. It makes sacred rules seem like decoration rather than law. To the British, Hawaii could look like abundance and welcome. To Hawaiians, it was home, with all the complexity that word carries. There were chiefs managing authority, priests guarding ritual order, commoners producing food, warriors watching power, and communities making judgments about strangers who had arrived with ships that looked almost impossible and appetites that were very real. Cook had been admired for his discipline in contact situations, but the final voyage had already shown a harder edge. At Hawaii, that edge mattered. The expedition needed supplies and cooperation, and Cook was accustomed to enforcing order when things went wrong. He had used seizures, threats, and punishment before to recover stolen property or discipline local resistance. The method had often worked well enough that he may have trusted it too much. It belonged to the practical toolbox of a naval commander, but a tool that works in one setting can fail badly in another. A hammer is useful, unless the problem is a window. Theft became a recurring irritant. Hawaiian people took iron and other items when they could, sometimes from the ships themselves. From the British side, this looked like a breach of trust and a threat to shipboard function. From the Hawaiian side, the presence of so much desirable material aboard foreign vessels created temptation and opportunity, and local ideas of exchange, rank, and access may not have matched British property rules. Cook could tolerate only so much. Each missing object became more than an object. It became a challenge to authority. It told the captain that his control was not complete. Meanwhile, the crew's behaviour could also create resentment. Men on shore did not always behave with restraint. There were sexual relationships, private trades, possible insults, and the usual disorder that comes when a disciplined ship releases men into an unfamiliar society. Some contacts may have been friendly and consensual within local systems. Others may have caused anger or conflict. Disease was always a threat, whether understood or not. Europeans had already brought illnesses into Pacific communities before, and even when no one intended harm, bodies carried consequences. The ships came with goods, hunger, and microbes. Only the first two were visible. the ceremonies around Cook added another layer of strain. He may have accepted honours without fully understanding their obligations. British officers described rituals that seemed extraordinary to them, including forms of prostration, chanting, offerings, and formal attention from priests and chiefs. They were impressed, but impression is not comprehension. Cook could be treated as sacred within a ritual frame and still become vulnerable when the frame changed. The British may have mistaken honour for submission. That is a common imperial mistake, and not a small one. Respect offered in a local system does not mean the visitor now owns the system. For a while, both sides managed the relationship. The ships continued to receive supplies. The Hawaiians continued to trade and observe. The British repaired their vessels. Cook prepared to leave. That departure was important. A visit that strains local patience can end peacefully if the visitors go at the right time. The ships did leave Kealakekua Bay in early February 1779, and for a moment it seemed the stay had concluded. Whatever tensions had grown, they had not yet broken into disaster. The expedition was again on its way, heading back toward the sea and the unfinished northern mission. Then Resolution's foremast was damaged. This practical problem changed everything. A ship's mast is not a decorative pole for holding patriotic cloth. It is central to movement and survival. Without proper repair, the vessel could not safely continue across the Pacific or return to the Arctic search. Cook had no real choice. The ships had to go back to Kealakekua Bay. This return after departure carried a different meaning. The British came back because they needed repair. From their point of view, it was simple necessity. From the Hawaiian point of view, the meaning may have been more complicated and less welcome. The visitors who had arrived during a sacred season consumed great supplies, received honours, and then departed were now returning unexpectedly after the ceremonial moment had shifted. A guest who leaves and then comes back with more needs is not always received the same way. Even in ordinary life, this is true. If someone stays at your house, eats half the pantry, receives polite hospitality, finally leaves, and then knocks again because their cartwheel is broken, one tries to remain gracious. One may also look at the pantry with concern. The second entry into the bay was colder in feeling, even though the climate had not changed. The welcome was reduced, supplies were less freely given, suspicion was stronger. Crowds still gathered, but the atmosphere had shifted. Cook and his men were now facing the dangerous difference between a first welcome and a reluctant return. They needed cooperation precisely when local patience may have been thinning. Repairing the mast required time and work. Timber, space, tools and labour had to be organised. The ships could not simply anchor, fix the problem in an afternoon, and leave. The longer they stayed, the more tension sharpened. Theft increased, British anger increased, Hawaiian resistance or assertiveness increased. The relationship that had once been cushioned by ceremony and abundance now became more openly transactional and strained. Cook's authority was also under pressure in front of his own men. A captain must not appear powerless when property is stolen or orders ignored. On a ship, authority is not an ornament. It is the system that keeps everyone alive. If local people could take from the ship without consequence, Cook may have feared that discipline and safety would weaken. This does not mean his responses were wise. It means the logic of command pushed him toward firmness, even when firmness was becoming dangerous. There were clashes. British parties fired shots in some situations. Hawaiians became more openly resistant. The careful balance of the first day was gone. The bay, which had seemed a place of plenty and welcome, now held a different mood. The same water, the same shore, the same green slopes, but the relationship had changed. This is why the title paradise can mislead if left unchallenged. A place can be beautiful and dangerous at the same time. More accurately, a place can be beautiful while people inside it face political tension, insult, fear, and exhaustion. Beauty does not prevent violence. Sometimes it only makes later retellings more confused. The British still needed to finish repairs. The Hawaiians still had to live with the disruption of the ships. Every day added friction. The presence of armed strangers became harder to absorb. The visitors' needs did not shrink. Local patience did not grow. The mission north still waited, making Cook impatient with anything that delayed departure. After the disappointment of the ice, after the effort of the return, after the damage to the mast, every stolen item and every failed negotiation may have felt larger than it was. Pressure does not make men see clearly. It often makes them see urgently. One of the most important differences between Cook's earlier Pacific work and this moment is that he no longer had the same margin for graceful withdrawal. In many island encounters, if relations became strained, the ships could leave once basic needs were met. At Kealakekua Bay, after the mast damage, leaving too soon was unsafe. They had to stay long enough to repair. Necessity tied them to a deteriorating relationship. That is one of the classic conditions for disaster. People who do not trust one another, forced by practical need to remain close. The Hawaiians too were dealing with internal politics that Cook did not fully understand. Chiefs and priests did not necessarily have one single response to the British. Some may have wanted continued exchange, others may have been angry or suspicious. Different groups may have seen different advantages or risks. A large foreign presence could affect local power. The British often preferred to deal with the chief as if authority was simple and singular, because that made negotiation easier in their minds. But local politics were layered. A decision made by one leader might not control every person. A gift from one group might not mean another group agreed. A theft by one person might become a crisis involving many. The sacred status or ritual framing around Cook also became unstable. If he'd been treated in connection with Lono during Makahiki, then his return after departure may have disturbed the expected order. Some historians have suggested that Cook's reappearance after the ritual season helped change how he was perceived. Even without reducing the matter to a single explanation, it is clear that the meaning of his presence was not fixed. Cook may have thought he was simply returning for repairs. Hawaiians may have seen a visitor whose proper time had passed, whose demands continued, and whose men were increasingly troublesome. Those are not small differences. They are different realities occupying the same bay. The British journals describe rising tension. Items were stolen. Attempts to recover them became more forceful. There were confrontations over boats and property. Cook's method of taking chiefs, or important persons as leverage, had been used before, and he would soon consider it again. This approach depended on a dangerous assumption, that local people would value the safety of the seized leader enough to return property, and that they would not instead resist violently. It also assumed that Cook could control the situation once he initiated it. At Kealakekua Bay, those assumptions were becoming weaker by the hour. For the crew, the mood must have been uneasy. Sailors are alert to changes in local atmosphere, even if they do not understand all the causes. A beach that felt open one week can feel hostile the next. Canoes that once came freely can seem watchful. Crowds can become threatening by number alone. The men knew they were far from home, dependent on repair, surrounded by people who were no longer clearly friendly, and led by a captain who was increasingly determined to enforce order. That combination can make every movement feel sharper. A shouted word, a missing tool, a musket raised, a stone thrown, all can carry more meaning than intended. Cook's greatness had always rested on control. Control of ships, routes, health, discipline, observation, and risk. At Hawaii, control was slipping. Not completely, not yet, but enough. He could not control the ritual meaning of his arrival. He could not control the political divisions on shore. He could not control every sailor's behaviour. He could not control every theft. He could not control the damaged mast that forced him back into the bay. He could not control the rising frustration of people who had already hosted his expedition once. He could still give orders, but the world around those orders was no longer arranging itself to obey. That is the shadow over the paradise. It is not a supernatural shadow, and it is not one single bad omen waiting in the palm trees. It is made of practical things. Food taken day after day, iron desired and stolen, sailors difficult to manage, sacred timing misunderstood, chiefs balance in authority, a captain under strain, ships in need of repair, a failed Arctic search waiting to be resumed, two systems of power trying to occupy the same shore without sharing the same rules. Kealakekwa Bay was still beautiful. The water still held the ships, the land still rose green around them, people still moved in canoes, fire still burned ashore. The ordinary life of Hawaii continued around the extraordinary disturbance of the expedition. Children, farmers, fishers, priests, chiefs, women carrying food, men watching the ships, sailors mending gear, officers writing notes, carpenters working the damaged mast. History often happens inside ordinary labour. Not everyone present would have felt the same tension in the same way at the same moment. Some may have still hoped the strangers would leave without worse trouble. Some may have wanted them gone immediately. Some may have seen opportunity right up to the edge of violence. Cook, meanwhile, was close to the end and did not know it. That is one of the hardest things about reading this moment. He had survived so much. The Antarctic cold, Pacific crossings, dangerous coasts, storms, disease, long command, the ice of the north. He had returned from the edge of the known world more than once. It would have been easy for him, and for those around him, to believe that this crisis too could be managed. A stolen object, an angry crowd, a reluctant chief, a show of force. These were not new elements in Cook's experience. He had faced versions of them before. The danger was that this time the pattern would not produce the old result. The damaged mast kept the ships in the bay. The rising thefts and confrontations kept anger alive. The need to assert authority pushed Cook toward a familiar tactic. The Hawaiian response was no longer shaped by the same generous conditions as the first arrival. By now, the expedition was standing very close to the line between tense contact and open violence. No one had to plan a grand tragedy for it to happen. The pieces were already in place, carried there by exhaustion, misunderstanding, pride, hunger, sacred timing, and the hard habits of command. The next movement would begin with another theft, one that mattered deeply to the British because it involved a ship's boat. A boat was not a trinket. It was a working part of the vessel, a lifeline between ship and shore, essential for movement, water, wood, communication, and survival. To Cook, recovering it would be necessary. To recover it, he would reach again for the method he knew, seize a high-ranking chief and hold him until the stolen property was returned. In another place, at another time, perhaps it might have worked as before. At Kealakekwa Bay, after the welcome had cooled, after the sacred season had shifted, after anger had grown on both sides, that decision would carry him onto the beach in the morning light, surrounded by people who no longer saw the situation as he did. The stolen boat changed the mood of the bay more sharply than almost anything else could have done. To someone on shore, a boat might look like one more large object belonging to the floating strangers, useful, valuable, and perhaps available if taken at the right moment. To Cook and his officers, it was not simply property, it was part of the ship's working body. A cutter carried men, water casks, wood, messages, supplies, and authority between vessel and shore. It made the difference between a ship being mobile and a ship being trapped at anchor, dependent on other boats, and good luck. Losing it was not like losing a spoon, even if sailors have been known to become emotional about spoons after enough months at sea. The cutter belonged to Discovery, and it was taken during the night. When the loss was discovered, the British response was immediate anger mixed with alarm. The ships were already in a tense position. They had returned to Kealakekwa Bay unwillingly because Resolution needed repair. The earlier welcome had cooled. The relationship with the Hawaiians had become strained by theft, demands, crowding, and the simple fact that the visitors had stayed too long, left, and then come back. Now a boat had been taken. To Cook, this could not be allowed to stand. If a ship's boat could be removed without consequence, then the expedition's authority and safety were both in question. Cook had faced similar problems before, and he reached for a method he had used in other places. He would seize an important chief and hold him until the stolen property was returned. This was not a sudden invention. It belonged to the pattern of European contact in the Pacific, and Cook had used versions of it successfully before. From his point of view, it could seem controlled, practical, and less deadly than open attack. Take a person of high rank, apply pressure, recover the item, release the person, restore order. It had the neat shape of a procedure. But Kealakekwa Bay was no longer a place where procedures could be trusted. The situation had too many moving parts. Hawaiian chiefs had their own authority and obligations. The people gathered around the bay were not a single obedient crowd waiting to follow one order. There were warriors, priests, commoners, relatives, attendants, curious onlookers, and people already angry about earlier incidents. The British were no longer new wonders arriving in a sacred season of welcome. They were armed strangers who had returned after leaving, now demanding repairs, supplies, and obedience. Cook's old tactic depended on predictability. The bay had become unpredictable. The target of the plan was Kalaniʻōpuʻu, the High Chief of the island of Hawaii. He was not merely a convenient local leader. He was a person of great rank, tied to the political and sacred order of the island. To seize him was to touch the centre of authority in a very dangerous way. Cook may have understood that Kalaniʻōpuʻu was important, but understanding importance is not the same as understanding the full consequences of laying hands on it. In British naval practice, taking a high-ranking person as temporary security might seem harsh, but practical. In Hawaiian terms, it could mean a profound violation, especially in a bay already tense with suspicion. That morning, Cook went ashore with armed men. The details have been told and retold, but the outline is clear enough. He intended to bring Kalaniʻōpuʻu aboard one of the ships, not necessarily with immediate violence, but under pressure. The British hoped that once the chief was aboard, the Hawaiians would return the cutter. It was a gamble presented as an established tactic. Cook had reason to believe it might work because similar pressure had worked elsewhere. He also had reason to worry that if he did nothing, more would be taken and British authority would collapse. These were the calculations of command. They were also the calculations of a tired man under strain. Cook was not acting in a quiet study with time to weigh cultures, emotions, and sacred authority. He was standing in a hot, crowded, unstable situation after years at sea, after Arctic disappointment, after damage to his ship, after days of tension, and after the loss of an essential boat. That does not make the decision wise. It makes the decision human. History often turns on choices made by people who are tired, pressed, angry, and convinced that they have solved this kind of problem before. At first, the plan did not immediately fail. Cook and his party approached Kalaniʻōpuʻu, and the chief seems to have agreed, or at least allowed himself to be led toward the shore. The early movement may have appeared calm enough to the British. This was important. If the chief could be brought quietly to the boat, the whole matter might proceed without bloodshed. Cook likely expected that the pressure would be understood and that the stolen cutter would be restored. It is possible that Kalaniʻōpuʻu himself was trying to avoid escalation. He was not a powerless man being dragged without thought. He was a high chief moving within a crowd, under pressure from foreigners, watched by his own people, and surrounded by competing signals. As they moved toward the water, the crowd grew. This was not unusual in itself. A British landing party drew attention. Cook was famous in the bay by then, and the movement of the High Chief toward the ships would have alarmed people. But the growing crowd changed the balance. A small negotiation can become a public crisis when enough people gather to witness it. Every step becomes visible. Every hesitation becomes meaningful. A chief's dignity is now at stake before his people. the foreigner's intention becomes harder to disguise. People begin to talk, shout, question, warn, and push closer. Kalaniʻopu's wives and attendants reportedly try to stop him from going farther. This detail matters because it shows that the danger was being recognised in the moment. Those close to him may have understood that boarding the British ship would place him in unacceptable danger or humiliation. They may also have sensed that the crowd would not allow it. A chief could not simply be taken from the shore without consequence. Cook's plan depended on the chief's movement into British control. Hawaiian resistance began before weapons fully decided the matter. The situation then worsened because news spread that another chief had been killed elsewhere, in a confrontation with the British. Whether every person in the crowd understood the details correctly hardly mattered. Rumour in a tense crowd can move faster than fact. If people believed that the British had killed a chief, then the attempt to take Kalaniʻopu became more frightening and more urgent. A hostage-taking that might already have seemed dangerous could suddenly look like the beginning of execution or abduction. The crowd's mood shifted further. Anger became sharper. Fear became action. Cook was still trying to hold control, but control was slipping into noise. The Marines and sailors with him were armed, but their position was not secure. They were on the shore, with the sea behind them and a growing number of Hawaiians around them. The boats waited nearby, but not every man could simply step calmly backward and leave. A landing party can feel strong while moving forward with purpose. It can feel much less strong when surrounded, uncertain, and trying not to fire too soon. This is one of the practical dangers of armed diplomacy. The presence of weapons is meant to prevent violence, but once the crowd stops being intimidated, those weapons become part of the crisis. A musket held by a nervous man can turn a quarrel into a killing. A shot fired into the air can be misunderstood. A shot fired at a person changes everything. And 18th century firearms, for all their power, were slow and awkward. A musket was frightening, but it was not a modern weapon capable of controlling a crowd with easy certainty. Once fired, it had to be reloaded. In close quarters, that mattered. Cook had often been able to use display, discipline, and controlled force to shape events. At Kealakekua Bay, the crowd no longer behaved as his experience expected. The Hawaiians were not simply scattering, they were pressing closer. Warriors were present. Stones, clubs, daggers and spears could come into use quickly. The British had guns, but the Hawaiians had numbers, anger, and the advantage of being on their own shore. The moral authority of the moment from the Hawaiian side was also not with the British. A high chief was being taken. A boat was not the only thing at issue now. The issue had become sovereignty, dignity, fear, and the immediate protection of Kalaniʻopu. Cook tried to manage the situation. He had not come ashore planning to die in a confused fight. He had not come intending a massacre either. He came intending a coercive negotiation, backed by force. But there is a very dangerous space between threat and violence. It can be crossed without anyone fully deciding to cross it. One man pushes, another raises a weapon, someone shouts, someone fires, someone falls. After that, every person present reacts to a situation that has already changed. The boats from the ships were involved in the wider attempt to block movement in the bay and prevent canoes from escaping with the stolen cutter or other goods. This was part of Cook's plan. Control the shore, control the chief, control the harbour, force the return. On paper, or in a captain's mind, it may have looked coordinated. In practice, it meant armed British parties spread across a hostile and confused environment. Communication was difficult. Events in one place affected emotions in another. A shot fired somewhere else could alter the crowd around Cook before he knew exactly what had happened. The British also underestimated how quickly their sacred or honoured status could vanish. During the earlier stay, Cook may have been treated with extraordinary respect. Some of his men may have believed that this respect would continue to protect him, but ritual status is not armour. It depends on conditions. Once Cook's actions seemed to violate local order, once he tried to remove the High Chief, once people believed British violence had already killed a leader, the meaning of his presence changed. The man who had been received with ceremony could become the man threatening the island's authority. That change could happen within minutes. Kalaniopuu stopped moving toward the boats. The plan was failing in the open, in front of everyone. This was a critical moment. If Cook retreated, he might lose face and still perhaps save lives. If he pressed on, he risked turning resistance into fighting. A commander trained to maintain authority often finds retreat difficult, especially in front of his men, and before a crowd he already believes has challenged him. Yet retreat at the right moment can be the highest form of command. The trouble is that men often recognize the right moment only after it has passed. Cook's temper and judgment at this point have been discussed for generations. Some accounts suggest he was angry. Some present him as trying to stay calm. Both may be true in different degrees. A man can be outwardly controlled and inwardly furious. He can still be giving orders while his patience is gone. The broader fact remains that his method no longer matched the situation. He had chosen to seize the chief and the crowd was refusing to allow it. Then came the firing. In the confusion, Cook shot at a Hawaiian warrior. One account says he fired with small shot first, which did not stop the man because of protective matting, and then used a ball round. Whether the precise sequence is told the same way in every account is less important than the effect. A Hawaiian was shot. British fire had entered the crowd. The boundary between threat and killing had been crossed. After that, the landing party's danger increased sharply. For the Hawaiians, the killing or wounding of their people confirmed that the British were not merely demanding the return of property. They were an immediate threat. For the British, the crowd's movement confirmed that they were in danger and might need to fight their way out. This is how violence feeds itself. Each side reads the other's defensive act as aggression. Each act creates the next justification. A few minutes earlier, there was still a possibility, however fragile, of withdrawal. Now the beach was becoming a battlefield. The Marines fired. Some Hawaiians fell. Others did not retreat in the way Cook may have expected. Instead, the crowd pressed harder. Warriors understood that muskets were deadly but not invincible. They'd seen enough by now to know that guns took time to reload and that close combat could overcome them. If a man could get inside the firing distance, a club or dagger could become more useful than a discharged musket. The British line, if it can be called that, was not a secure formation on a parade ground. It was a small armed group on a crowded beach, trying to retreat to boats under pressure. Cook found himself near the waterline, trying to direct his men and the boats. He turned reportedly toward the boats or the Marines, perhaps to order a ceasefire or to signal withdrawal. That turning mattered. In some accounts, the Hawaiian saw that his back was exposed, and one warrior struck. Another attacked. In close quarters, Cook's authority, reputation and experience could not protect him. The great navigator was now one man on a beach, surrounded by people who believed he had become dangerous. But before we move fully into that final moment, it is worth slowing down because the breaking point was not only the instant of attack, it was the whole morning tightening around a failed assumption. Cook assumed he could seize Kalaniopuu and use him as leverage. The Hawaiians refused to let that happen. Cook assumed that armed discipline could control the crowd. The crowd did not respond as expected. The British assumed that the stolen cutter was the central issue. For many Hawaiians, the central issue had become the attempted removal of their high chief and the violence of armed strangers. Both sides were acting within their own logic, and those logics collided on the beach. The theft of the cutter mattered, but it did not contain the whole meaning of the crisis. If we say only that Cook died because a boat was stolen, the story becomes too small and too simple. The boat was the trigger. The powder had been laid earlier. It had been laid by the long stay, the unexpected return, the shifting ritual season, the demand for supplies, earlier confrontations, thefts and reprisals, sailors' behaviour, sacred misunderstandings, imperial assumptions, local politics, and Cook's reliance on coercive methods. The cutter gave the crisis a form. It did not create the whole crisis from nothing. This is why Kealakekwa Bay is so often argued over. It resists a single explanation. Some older accounts made Cook a noble martyr killed by people who failed to appreciate him. Some later accounts made him only an agent of empire whose death was the inevitable result of violence he helped bring. The human truth is more complicated. Cook was a brilliant navigator and an imperial officer. He was capable of restraint and capable of force. Hawaiians were not a faceless crowd, but people defending authority, responding to danger, and acting within their own political and sacred world. The tragedy came from contact under pressure, not from one side being simple. On that morning, no one had a full view of all the causes. Cook did not stand on the beach thinking, "This is the result of years of imperial contact and cultural misunderstanding." He was thinking like a captain trying to recover a boat and enforce order. The Hawaiians around him were not thinking as symbols in a later historical debate. They were watching their chief being led toward foreign ships after violence had already broken trust. They were making urgent decisions in a place that belonged to them. The men in the boats were not thinking about historical legacy. They were trying to survive, follow orders, and understand what was happening through smoke, shouting, surf, and fear. The sound of the scene would have been harsh and confusing, surf on the shore. Canoes in the water, shouting in Hawaiian and English, orders from officers, muskets firing, people crying out, feet on stones or sand, the thud of bodies, the crack of weapons, the splash of men trying to reach boats, the smell of powder, the bright morning light making everything visible and still not understandable. History can look tidy when written later, but in the moment it was noise. Cook's men were trained, but training has limits when panic rises. The Marines could fire volleys, but they could not easily hold ground against a crowd if the boats were not properly positioned or if confusion broke the line. Some of the British were cut off, some were killed, others escaped. Officers had to decide whether to fire from the boats or ships, whether to rescue, whether to pull away, whether to risk more men. A landing that was meant to seize one chief had become a fight for survival. The Hawaiians, too, faced danger. British firearms killed and wounded people. Warriors who moved against the landing party did so under fire. This was not a one-sided attack against helpless men. It was a violent confrontation in which people on both sides died, but the location mattered. It was Hawaiian land. The British had come ashore armed, intending to take the island's high chief. That fact shaped the moral centre of the event, even if British accounts long tried to frame the matter, mainly as the murder of a great explorer. The breaking point also revealed how quickly Cook's personal authority depended on context. Aboard Resolution, his word was law. On a chart, his line could define coastlines for European navigators. In London, his name carried admiration. In Kealakekwa Bay, surrounded by Hawaiians defending their chief, his authority was no longer accepted. It did not matter that he had crossed the Antarctic Circle. It did not matter that he had mapped New Zealand or the eastern coast of Australia for Britain. It did not matter that he had reached the ice of the Bering Strait. Reputation travels poorly when people believe you are threatening their leader. There is something sobering in that. Cook's life had been built on movement through spaces where his skill allowed him to survive and command. But here, at the edge of the water, the skills that had brought him across the world could not solve the immediate human crisis. Navigation could not help. Discipline could not fully help. Scientific curiosity could not help. His experience may even have hurt him, because it encouraged him to trust a tactic that had worked before. The very habits of success became dangerous when the conditions changed. Kalani'opu'u did not go aboard the ship. That alone marks the failure of Cook's plan. The High Chief remained with his people. The British did not recover control through hostage-taking. Instead, the attempt turned into the moment that shattered whatever remained of the relationship. After the violence on the beach, there could be no easy return to ceremony, trade, and repair. The bay had crossed into another state. The ships were still there. The mast still needed attention. The men still needed to survive. But the old arrangement was gone. For those aboard Resolution and Discovery watching from the water, the scene must have been almost impossible to process. Cook was not only the captain, he was the centre of the expedition's identity. Many had sailed with him before. They had seen him command through storms, illness, and unknown coasts. He was the reason the voyage had credibility. To see him trapped in a violent crowd, to see the landing party break, to hear shots and shouting from shore, must have produced disbelief before grief. A famous man does not look famous when surrounded by chaos. He looks suddenly mortal. The British response would soon become harsher, because grief and anger aboard armed ships rarely remain quiet. But in the immediate breaking point, before retaliation and negotiation over bodies, before the story was written into journals and later turned into legend, there was only the failed mourning, the stolen cutter, the decision to seize Kalaniopuu, the movement toward the shore, the stopping of the chief, the crowd growing, the rumour of killing, the firing, the rush, the collapse of command at the waterline. This was the moment when the final expedition changed from a difficult voyage into a tragedy, not because everything after it was unimportant, but because the centre had broken. Cook's authority, which had carried the expedition across oceans, could not carry him through this encounter. The Hawaiian world, which had first received him with ceremony and abundance, now resisted him with force. The two ships, which had survived ice and distance, now sat in a bay where the greatest danger came from the human consequences of their own presence. And still, the day was not finished. The men aboard had to understand who was alive and who was missing. Officers had to take command. The ships had to protect themselves. Hawaiians on shore had to respond to the deaths in the presence of British guns. The stolen cutter was no longer the main concern, though it had started the chain of events. Now there were bodies, anger, fear, and the terrible fact that Captain Cook had been pulled into close combat on a beach far from home. The next part of the story belongs to the death itself, to the shock that followed, and to the way an expedition built around one man tried to continue after the shore at Kealakekua Bay had taken him from it. Cook's death did not arrive with the clean shape that later paintings tried to give it. It came in confusion, close to the water, with shouting, smoke, bodies pressing in from every side, and men trying to understand too much at once. The great captain of the Pacific, the careful surveyor, the man who had crossed the Antarctic Circle, charted coasts, watched Venus pass across the sun from Tahiti, pushed into the ice of the Bering Strait, and carried British science across half the globe, was now caught in a fight that had begun with the theft of a boat and the failed attempt to seize a high chief. He was struck near the shore, first knocked down or wounded, then attacked by Hawaiian warriors in the crush of the fight. British accounts describe him falling in the surf or at the edge of the water, where the retreat to the boats had become desperate. Men who might have helped him were themselves fighting, fleeing, reloading, or trying to pull away. The Marines fired. Hawaiians surged forward. Some British sailors and Marines were killed with him. Others escaped to the boats and back toward the ships, carrying the shock with them before they could fully turn it into words. For those watching from Resolution and Discovery, it must have been almost impossible to believe. Cook had been in danger many times before. He had moved through storms, reefs, ice, illness, and tense encounters with people across the Pacific. His officers knew that danger belonged to the work, but there is a difference between knowing a captain may be at risk and seeing, or hearing, that the centre of the expedition has been cut down on a beach. Cook was not only the commander, he was the reason the voyage made sense. His authority held together the route, the discipline, the purpose, and the reputation of the expedition. Once he was dead, the ships remained afloat, but something invisible had gone out of them. The first feeling aboard may not even have been grief. It may have been disbelief, then anger, then fear. Fear, because the ships were still in the bay. The repairs were not simply finished and forgotten. The men were not safely on their way across open water. They remained within sight of the shore where their captain had just been killed, surrounded by people who are now enemies, or at least no longer safely called friends. The bay that had once seemed generous and ceremonial had become dangerous. Every canoe might be watched with suspicion. Every movement ashore might look like preparation for attack. Every sound from the land might carry threat. Command had to continue. That is one of the hard facts of naval life. A captain may die, but the ship cannot pause its existence out of respect. Sails still need tending, guns need manning, boats need guarding, orders need giving. Someone must decide what happens next. Charles Clark, commander of Discovery and second in overall command, became the leader of the expedition. Clark was experienced, brave, and familiar with Cook's ways, but he inherited the voyage at its worst moment. He was also ill with tuberculosis, though 18th century men did not describe it in quite the way a modern doctor would. He was not stepping into command from a place of health and calm. He was sick, under pressure, and now responsible for 2 ships in hostile circumstances after the death of one of the most famous navigators alive. The British response after Cook's death was shaped by rage, and by the practical need to recover the bodies of the dead. To the British, the return of Cook's remains became urgent, both emotionally and symbolically. A captain's body mattered. A famous captain's body mattered even more. Yet in Hawaiian practice, the treatment of Cook's body followed meanings that British officers did not understand at first. Parts of his remains were treated in ways connected to high status and ritual handling, not simply desecration as British anger imagined. But in the shock of the moment, the men aboard the ships were in no position to interpret Hawaiian mortuary practice with calm anthropological care. They saw their commander killed and his body taken. They wanted him back. Violence followed. British parties fired on Hawaiians. There were clashes, burning, and retaliation. Some of the response was tied to recovering remains. Some was anger. Some was the harsh logic of armed ships trying to reassert control after humiliation and loss. This is where the expedition's darker side became plain. The same ships that had carried astronomers, artists, naturalists, and charts also carried cannon and muskets. When trust collapsed, the scientific voyage revealed its military bones. The men who had once traded nails for food now fired into the world that had fed them. It is important not to flatten what happened into one simple moral picture. Cook's death was not a random murder of a harmless guest. Nor was every British sailor only a monster of empire. The Hawaiians were defending their high chief and their world from an armed attempt to take him. The British were reacting to the loss of their commander and several comrades in a situation they experienced as betrayal and danger. Both sides had dead to mourn. Both sides acted from fear and anger. But the larger imbalance remained. The British were armed intruders far from home, trying to enforce their own rules in a Hawaiian sacred and political place. The Hawaiians were on their own land, facing foreign ships that had demanded food, taken liberties, returned after leaving, and then attempted to seize their ruler. The remains of Cook were eventually returned in part. What came back to the British was enough for them to hold a burial at sea. The ceremony must have been strange and heavy. The man who had spent his life crossing oceans was committed back to one of them, far from Yorkshire, far from London, far from the rooms where his charts would later be studied and his name praised. Sailors knew death at sea. They had watched men go overboard, die of illness, fall from rigging, vanish in storms, or waste away after injury. But Cook's burial was different. It marked not only the loss of a man, but the collapse of the expedition's confidence in itself. And yet, the voyage did not end there. That may be one of the most sobering parts of the story. In a film, the death of the great captain might be the final scene. The camera would pull away from the bay, the music would swell, and history would close the book. But real expeditions do not end when the most famous person dies. The ship still had to leave Hawaii. The crews still had to survive. The Admiralty's instructions still existed. The Northwest Passage had still not been found. The men could not simply dissolve into grief and drift home. They had to continue. After repairs and the recovery of what could be recovered, resolution and discovery left Hawaii. One can imagine the feeling aboard as the islands faded behind them. The men had arrived seeking rest and provisions after the northern ice. They left with Cook dead, relations broken, and the voyage altered forever. Hawaii had entered British records as a major discovery in European terms, but it had also become the place where the greatest British navigator of the age met his end. For Hawaiians, the event belonged to their own history, tied to their chiefs, sacred order, and response to foreign intrusion. The same beach carried different meanings depending on which shore of memory one stood upon. Clark now led the expedition back toward the north. That fact alone says something about the discipline and expectations of the time. The captain was dead, the crews were shaken, and still the mission resumed. They would try again to search for the passage. The Arctic question had not released them. If anything, Cook's death made the continuation feel like a duty owed to him, to the Admiralty, and to the whole purpose of the voyage. The ships turned once more toward colder waters, carrying the absence of the man who had brought them there. The second northern attempt did not produce the dreamed-of passage. Once again, the expedition faced ice. Once again, the Arctic refused. Clerc, already ill, had to push the ships while his body was failing. It is a hard image. A sick commander leading worn vessels back into the same cold uncertainty that had frustrated Cook. The sea did not become kinder because command had passed to a dying man. The ice did not open out of respect. The Northwest Passage remained beyond them. Clerc's health worsened, and he died later in 1779, after the renewed attempt in the north. Now the expedition had lost both of its senior commanders. First Cook, killed in Hawaii, then Clark, taken by illness after carrying the mission forward. Command passed to John Gore, an experienced officer who had sailed with Cook before. Under Gore and James King, the ships would complete the long return journey. By then, the great expedition was no longer a story of bold expectation. It was a story of endurance after loss. The surviving men still had far to go. From the northern Pacific, they moved across routes that would eventually take them toward Kamchatka, Macau, Canton, the Cape of Good Hope, and finally home. Along the way, they discovered the commercial value of the sea otter pelts, obtained on the northwest coast of America. In China, those furs brought high prices, and the news helped spark a new wave of trade in the Pacific Northwest. This was one of the expedition's important consequences, though not one Cook had set out to create. A voyage sent to find a northern passage helped point merchants toward fur profits instead. History is very fond of giving people results they did not order. The voyage returned to Britain in 1780. The world that received the surviving ships was not exactly the world they had left. The American War had continued. Imperial confidence had been shaken in one direction, while British ambition remained active in others. Cook was dead, but his fame did not die with him. In some ways, death made him larger. A living commander can be criticised, questioned, complicated, and known by those who worked with him. A dead explorer can be polished into symbol. Cook became a national figure of extraordinary achievement, the navigator who had gone farther, mapped more, preserved crews, served science, and died in the Pacific during his final voyage. That legend was powerful and not entirely false. Cook really was one of the greatest navigators in European history. His charts were remarkable. His discipline saved lives. His voyages transformed European knowledge of the Pacific and Southern Oceans. He observed carefully, sailed boldly, and rose from modest beginnings by ability. Those facts do not vanish because the story is also darker. A fair account does not need to make him small in order to make him human. But the legend also hid things. It hid the Pacific peoples who met him as full historical actors, not background figures. It hid the violence and coercion that accompanied even scientific exploration. It hid the way charts could serve empire. It hid the cost of European arrival for indigenous societies, including disease, disruption, resource pressure, political change, and later colonization. It often turned Cook's death into a simple tale of savagery or martyrdom, when the real story was a tense collision between a British expedition under strain and a Hawaiian society defending its own order. The greatness of the expedition then cannot be separated from its unravelling. This is what makes it such a powerful story. It began with ambition on a vast scale. Return Omai, revisit the Pacific, gather knowledge, search the northern coast, find the Northwest Passage if it exists, carry British science and navigation into the unknown. The plan had clarity, the ships had skill, Cook had reputation. But as the voyage stretched across years, the pressures multiplied. The Central Pacific brought warmth and beauty, but also signs of tension. The North Pacific brought new knowledge, but also cold, disappointment, and exhaustion. Hawaii brought refuge, then ceremony, then misunderstanding, then violence. The Arctic dream failed. The captain died. The second commander died. The surviving ships came home with charts, collections, journals, and a story much heavier than the one that had been planned. If we look only at the map, the expedition was extraordinary. It traced routes from Britain to the southern oceans, into the Pacific, through Tonga and Tahiti, to Hawaii, along the northwest coast of America, into Alaska and the Bering Strait, back to Hawaii, north again, and then home through Asia and around the world. Few voyages in history carried such range. Few combined so much geography, science, diplomacy, hardship, and consequence. It truly was one of the greatest expeditions in history, but not because it was clean, noble, or triumphant from beginning to end. It was great in the older sense of the word, large, difficult, consequential, and impossible to reduce to comfort. Cook's final expedition teaches us that exploration is never just motion across space. It is contact, it is pressure, it is misunderstanding, it is hunger, authority, curiosity, fear, and trade. It is the meeting of people who do not share the same rules, but must still react to one another in real time. It is a captain believing a method will work because it has worked before. It is a community deciding that this time it will not. It is a stolen boat becoming the trigger for a conflict built from many earlier strains. It is ice refusing ambition in the north, and a beach refusing authority in the south. For Cook himself, the final voyage reveals both the height and the limit of his life's work. He had spent decades making the unknown more navigable for Britain. He had turned blank European spaces into charts. He had carried instruments into places where mathematics met wind and wave. He had shown unusual skill in keeping ships alive over distances that still seem enormous. Yet at the end, the problem was not a reef he could sound, a coast he could measure, or a star he could observe. It was a human situation he misread, under pressure, in a place where his authority did not mean what he thought it meant. That is not a small ending. It is a deeply human one. A man's greatest strengths can carry him far and still fail him at the point where the world changes its terms. Cook's discipline, confidence, and command had made his career. At Kealakekua Bay, those same habits helped lead him into danger. He believed order could be restored by taking control of the chief. Instead, the attempt showed him that control had already passed beyond him. The expedition survivors brought back more than news of his death. They brought back charts, journals, drawings, specimens, observations, and information that would shape European understanding of the Pacific and the Arctic. They brought back the knowledge that the Northwest Passage, if it existed, was not open to them in any practical way. They brought back evidence of rich fur resources that would draw more ships to the northwest coast. They brought back stories of Hawaii that would lead other Europeans and Americans there in increasing numbers. Cook died, but the processes his voyages helped accelerate continued. For the peoples of the Pacific, the aftermath stretched far beyond the lives of Cook's crew. More ships came, trade expanded, diseases spread. Missionaries, merchants, whalers, soldiers, settlers, and officials followed in different places at different times. Local societies adapted, resisted, negotiated, suffered, and changed. Cook's voyages did not alone create all of this, but they were part of the opening of a new era of intensified contact. The charts that helped ships avoid reefs also helped them return. Knowledge made distance smaller. Distance becoming smaller is not always a kindness. And now, after crossing all of this history, we come back to the quiet room where this story began. Perhaps you're still awake. Perhaps only partly. Perhaps Cook's ships have blurred a little in your mind into sails, cold water, island light, and the creak of timber. That is all right. History does not always need to be held tightly. Sometimes it can be allowed to pass slowly, like a ship moving beyond the edge of sight. We have followed a man already famous enough to rest, who chose or accepted one more voyage. We have seen the public face of science and the hidden pull of empire. We have watched Omai return home with gifts that could not solve the problem of belonging. We have moved through Tonga and Tahiti, where welcome carried its own tensions. We have entered Hawaii first as an unexpected landfall, then returned after ice and failure made the islands necessary. We have followed the ships north to Alaska, into fog, cold, and the blocked dream of the Northwest Passage. We have stood at Kealakekua Bay as a practical crisis became a fatal confrontation, and we have watched the expedition continue after the death of the man whose name would forever be attached to it. So what remains of Captain Cook at the end of this long voyage? Not a simple hero. Not a simple villain, a skilled navigator, a servant of empire, a careful observer, a severe commander, a man of real achievement and real limits, a figure whose maps changed history and whose final actions remind us that no map can fully explain the people living inside it. If you found this long journey calming, thoughtful, or simply a quiet place to rest for a while, I would be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, or shared it with someone who enjoys history told slowly. It helps this little harbour of stories reach other tired minds at the end of the day. For now, let the ships fade into the dark water. Let the ice close again over the Northern Passage. Let the bay grow quiet after all its noise. Let the charts rest on the table, the ink dry, the lantern burn low. Cook's final expedition is over, but the questions it leaves behind are still with us. What discovery costs? Who gets to name the world? And how greatness can travel so far before meeting the one shore it cannot command. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are listening from tonight.